Hey there and welcome back. The day has had its fill of you by now, all its small demands and all its noise, and there is nothing left that you need to carry into the next few hours, so let your shoulders come down from where they have been holding themselves, settle back into the warmth of the bed, and let me tell you, slowly and from the very beginning, the story of a life. Most of us know, somewhere deep in us, what it is to want more than we were handed at the start, to glance back at the plain little place we came from and feel the pull of something larger and finer and further off. And tonight I would like to tell you about a woman who felt that pull as keenly as anyone who has ever lived, and who followed it further than almost a single soul of her birth had ever managed to go. This is a story for anyone who has ever made something out of very little, or wished that they could, and for anyone who simply likes to be told a long and a true tale in a quiet voice while the night settles in around them. Let me walk you through the whole of her years, from a draughty little manor up in the hills to a tower of glass that is standing yet, 4 centuries on, and you do not need to hold on to a single name or a single date as we go, for there is nothing here to memorize and nowhere at all that you need to be. You can let the details drift over you and simply follow the shape of it, the slow climb of one life across 100 years of change. And somewhere in the telling, before the night is through, we will come upon an old woman seated high in a house of glass that she had raised with her own money, a woman who had buried 4 husbands and outbuilt the proudest families in the land, and who kept beneath her roof a young girl that half the kingdom believed might one day wear the crown. Before we travel back to the beginning, there is one small thing I would like to ask of you, and then I will not break into the story again. I always find myself wondering about the people who gather around these quiet tales in the dark, scattered as you all are across so many different places and so many different hours. And so, if you have a moment and the wish, I would love it if you left a word below to say where in the world you are listening from tonight and what the weather is doing beyond your window. There is a strange and a gentle comfort, for me and I suspect for others too, in picturing all of us in our separate rooms, each one turned toward the same soft story at the close of the day. And if you find that these long walks through other lives and other ages are the kind of company you would like to keep again, on the nights when sleep is slow in coming, then you would be most welcome to subscribe, with no hurry and no pressure about it at all, so that another of them might come and find you when it is ready. That is the whole of it. And now let us go back, more than 400 years, to the green hills of Derbyshire and the small house where all of it began. Picture this: a low range of hills in the middle of England, in the county of Derbyshire, where the farmed and gentle country folds and rises toward the high bare moors of the north, and the wind comes in across the open ground with very little to stand in its way. Set on a slope among them, looking out across a wide sweep of fields and pasture and scattered wood, there stands a modest manor of grey local stone, old already in the years we are speaking of, and far from large, the seat of lesser gentry whose name has clung to this patch of earth for longer than anyone could rightly say. The house is called Hardwick, and the family has taken its name from the place, as families of that middling rank so often did, so that to be born within these walls is to be born a Hardwick of Hardwick, at one small fixed point in one small fixed corner of a wide kingdom. It is the kind of dwelling that shelters a single household of decent but unremarkable standing, with its central hall and its handful of chambers, its barns and its byres and its few servants, snug enough in its fashion, and yet a very long way indeed from anything that might be called grand. And it is here, in this unconsidered spot amid the Derbyshire hills, in the reign of King Henry VIII and somewhere around the year 1527, that a daughter is born to the house of Hardwick and given the name Elizabeth, though all her life through the people who knew her would call her Bess. Her people were of no particular consequence, the Hardwicks being gentry of the smaller sort, holding their land and their place but reaching nowhere near the ranks of the powerful, and she is one of several children, with sisters about her, and a brother who is the heir, so that from the very first she is a younger daughter in a crowded and a far from wealthy house, which in that age was close to the humblest position a child of any property could occupy. For a daughter of the gentry brought little but the cost of her keep, and in time the burden of a dowry that must be found to marry her off. The land and the name passed to the sons, and the girls were a charge upon the estate, to be raised and provided for, and at last handed on to some other family in marriage. She is born into that plain arithmetic of birth and inheritance, a small girl with no fortune of her own and no obvious path before her, but the ordinary one, to be reared in the modest comfort of the manor and married, when her time came, to some neighbouring gentleman of much the same middling sort, and so to live out her days within a few miles of the hills she was born among. That, and nothing more, was what the world held in store for a younger daughter of Hardwick, and had she been an ordinary child, that is very likely what would have come to pass. But before she is even out of her infancy, a sudden blow falls that shadows her earliest years and sharpens perhaps the hunger that would drive her ever after. Her father, John Hardwick, the master of the little estate, dies while Bess is still a baby, leaving his widow with a clutch of children and an inheritance tangled in the harsh machinery of the age. For the heir, her brother, is a child far too young to take up his lands, and by the custom of that time, when a landholder died leaving an heir who was still a minor, the estate did not pass quietly to the family, but fell instead into the keeping of the Crown, under the cold arrangement that was called wardship. The Crown, or whoever bought the wardship from it, took the revenues of the land during the heir's long childhood, and the family was left to make do on whatever scraps the law allowed the widow, so that the death of John Hardwick did not merely rob his children of a father, but stripped the household, for years to come, of the greater part of its modest income. The Hardwicks were not cast into poverty, but they were pinched and straitened and made anxious, a gentry family clinging to its dignity on means that had suddenly shrunk, and the young Bess grew up in the knowledge, sunk deep into her before she could even name it, of how fragile a family's standing could be, and how swiftly the ground could shift beneath even those who seemed securely placed. It is worth pausing on this early lesson, for it would echo through the whole of her later life. The woman that Bess of Hardwick became was, above all things, a builder and a holder, a gatherer of land and money and houses, a person who could never quite stop accumulating and securing and tying down what she had won, and it is hard not to see, in that lifelong drive, the shadow of these straitened early years, when she had watched her widowed mother contrive and scrape to keep a roof and a name together against the cold workings of wardship and want. A child who learns that security is a thing easily lost will often spend a lifetime making certain it is never lost again, and Bess seems to have learned that lesson in her cradle on a wind-blown Derbyshire slope in a dwelling that could not pay its own way. Whatever gifts of character she was born with, and they were considerable, were forged early in the heat of that anxiety, the quiet, desperate striving of a proud family fallen on lean times. She would remember it, I think, in some buried way all her days, and she would build and go on building, as though no fortune could ever be quite large enough to silence the small frightened voice of the girl from the manor on the hill. Her mother, widowed and burdened, did what such women did, and wed again, taking a second husband of the same modest gentry rank in the hope of steadying the household, and so Bess grew up in a remade family with a stepfather, and in time, all her half-brothers and half-sisters to crowd the small chambers of the manor. It was not, by the measure of the age, an unhappy childhood for all its anxieties. She was fed and clothed and reared, taught the things a gentlewoman ought to know, the management of a household, the working of a needle, the keeping of accounts, the long patient arts of running a home and a small estate. These were not idle accomplishments, but the serious training of her sex and class, the skills by which a woman of property would one day order her own house and her own servants and her own affairs, and she, sharp and quick and watchful from the first, took them in and made them her own, learning in that cramped Derbyshire manor the very crafts of management and economy that she would one day practice on a scale her elders could never have dreamed of. The child was being schooled, all unknowing, for the work of her life. And so the years of her girlhood pass, in the ordinary round of a gentry childhood in a remote corner of the realm, the seasons turning over the hills, the household contriving and making do, the watchful girl growing toward womanhood with her wits about her and her future a blank. She is nobody yet, a younger daughter of an unremarkable house, with no fortune and no fame, and no reason in the world that anyone beyond her own valley should ever come to know her name. But the age into which she has been born is one of extraordinary movement and change, a period when the old certainties are breaking up, and new families are rising, and old ones falling, when a clever and a determined person, even a woman, even a younger daughter of the small gentry, might just possibly find a path upward that an earlier age would have barred. And Bess, though she does not know it yet, possesses exactly the gifts that such a moment rewards. What she needs is a way out of the valley, a door into the wider world, a first step onto the stair she is destined to climb. And in the custom of her age, that door is about to open, for the time has come for the child to be sent away from home. That is exactly where we are going next. When a daughter of the gentry reached the edge of her girlhood in the England of these years, she was very often sent away from her own home to be brought up for a time in the domestic establishment of some greater family, and it is into just such a placement that the young Bess is now sent out of the cramped manor of her birth, and into a wider and a grander way of living. The practice was an old and a settled one, a kind of apprenticeship in gentility, by which the children of lesser folk were placed in the homes of their betters to learn the manners and the accomplishments and the connections that could not be had at home. The boys went as pages and the girls as waiting gentlewomen, attending upon the lady of the house, sharing in the existence of an establishment, and absorbing, by daily example, the ways of a world above the one they had been born into. For a girl in particular, it was a serious matter, very nearly the entirety of her education and the launching of her prospects together, for it was in such a household that she would polish her manners, widen her acquaintance, and very likely, in the end, find the husband who would settle her future. To be well placed in a good house amid the right people was the best beginning a gentry daughter could hope for, and the Hardwicks, straitened as they were, contrived to place its sharp young Bess in the establishment of a family well above their own. The household she enters is that of a knightly family of standing, grander by far than anything she has known, and the move is for the watchful girl from the hills an education beyond anything books could give her. She passes almost overnight from the snug and the homely round of a small manor into the larger and more ordered world of a considerable establishment, with its greater wealth, its larger company of servants, its finer furnishings, and its more elaborate ways, and she sets herself, with the quickness that marked her always, to learn it. She watches the lady of the house at her work, the running of the household, the ordering of the servants, the management of the stores and the accounts, and the endless small business of keeping a grand establishment turning. She observes the comings and goings of visitors of rank, the careful gradations of courtesy, the way the powerful spoke and moved and dealt with one another. Below stairs and above, she takes the measure of this larger life, and she misses nothing, storing away in that retentive mind the knowledge of how a grand hall was held together, and how the people in it rose or fell. She is learning in these years of service the very trade she would spend her career perfecting, the management of houses and fortunes and people, and she is learning it from the inside, from below, with the hungry attention of one who means, some day, to have such a place of her own. And she is learning, too, the harder and the subtler lessons of how the world of the great actually worked, the lessons that no manor in the hills could ever have taught her. She sees how families allied themselves by marriage, how fortunes were made and secured and passed on, how favour and connection opened doors that mere merit never could. She begins to grasp the workings of patronage and kinship and interest that govern the lives of the powerful, the mighty web of obligation and advantage that bound the ruling families together. For a child of her keen intelligence and her sharp ambition, it was the most valuable schooling imaginable, a long, close study of the machinery of power and wealth, conducted from a position humble enough to see everything and threaten nobody. She made herself useful and agreeable and trusted. She formed attachments and won friends. She came to be valued in the household for her competence and her charm and her ready good sense. And all the while she was widening her acquaintance, drawing nearer to persons of greater consequence than any she had known before, weaving herself, thread by careful thread, into the fabric of a larger world. The younger daughter of Hardwick was on her way. It was in these years of service, too, that the personal gifts which carried her so far must first have shown themselves plainly, the qualities that made people trust her and favour her and want her near. She had charm, by every account the kind that warms and draws and holds. She had a quick and a practical intelligence, a head for figures and for business that was rare in anyone of that age, and rarer still in a woman. She had energy and resolution, and an unflagging appetite for work, and she had, beneath the agreeable surface, a will of remarkable strength, and a clear, unwavering sense of what she wanted. These were not the showy graces of the court, but the solid, useful virtues of management and persistence, and they were exactly the virtues that a fine household valued in a gentlewoman, and that the wider world would one day reward so richly. People liked Bess, and they came to rely on her, and being liked and relied upon, in that age as in ours, was the surest of all foundations for a rise in the world. She was building, even now, the first and the most important of all her assets, a reputation among people who mattered as a woman of sense and capability and worth. And so in the domestic establishment of her betters, the girl from the Derbyshire Manor came quietly into her own, no longer quite the obscure younger daughter of a straitened gentry family, but a valued and a promising gentlewoman, well placed, well liked, and watchful for whatever the future might bring. The door out of the valley had opened, and she had stepped through it. The long climb had begun, though its summit lay further off and higher up than anyone could possibly have guessed. She had her gifts, her training, her widening circle, and above all her fierce buried determination never to slip back toward the want and the anxiety of her childhood, and she was waiting, with the patience of the truly ambitious, for the first real chance to better herself. In the world of the gentry, that chance came for a woman, chiefly through marriage, the one noble transaction by which a woman could rise or fall in a single stroke, and she, now grown to a marriageable age in the household of a family, was about to make the first of the 4 marriages that would carry her, step by astonishing step, from the small manor on the hill to the very summit of the kingdom. Her first husband is waiting in the wings, and that is where our story turns now. In the establishment where Bess was placed, or somewhere in the wide circle of families connected to it, there was a young man named Robert Barlow, the son and heir of a neighbouring Derbyshire house of much the same gentry rank as her own, and it is to him, while she is still very young, that the first of her marriages joins her. The match was the ordinary kind for those of their station, an alliance of two local gentry families, sensible and unremarkable, the sort of marriage that knit the small landed houses of a county together and kept their lands and their names in steady circulation. There was nothing in it, on the face of things, to mark it out as the first step in an extraordinary career. Bess was perhaps 15 or 16 years old, very young even by the reckoning of that age, when she was wed to Robert Barlow, and the man she married was younger still in his strength if not in his years, for he was sickly, frail in health, a boy whose hold on life was already uncertain. It was not, one imagines, a great romance, this first marriage of a girl barely out of childhood to an ailing youth of her own neighbourhood. It was a practical joining of families, made in the ordinary way and for the ordinary reasons, and it might have passed without consequence into the unremembered roll of such matches. But it did not pass without consequence, for from this brief and modest beginning came the first small stone of the considerable fortune that Bess would spend her days building. For the marriage was tragically short. Robert Barlow, never strong, sickened and died within a matter of months of the wedding, while Bess was still only a child, leaving her a widow before she was well out of her childhood. There is a particular poignancy in it. This first marriage cut off almost before it had begun, the boy husband dead and the child bride left alone. And we should not let the larger story rob it of its human sadness, for whatever calculation lay around the match, two people had been joined and one of them was gone, and she at 15 or so had tasted, at the very threshold of her existence, the abrupt and the irreversible loss that the age dealt out so freely. Death was near and sudden in those years, as we shall have cause to remember again and again in this story, and it touched Bess early, taking her first husband almost as soon as she had been given him. She was a widow, young and alone. Her first venture into the wedded estate ended in a few short months by the same swift mortality that had taken her father before she could remember him. But the law of the age, harsh in so many ways to women, granted a widow one solid and a precious thing, and it is here that the long financial genius of Bess has its very first small triumph. For a widow was entitled to a jointure, a portion of her late husband's land set aside for her support during the remainder of her life, an income and a property that were hers by right, and that no one could easily take from her. And though Robert Barlow had been only a man of the modest gentry, and though the jointure due to his girl widow was correspondingly small, and was, as it happened, fiercely contested by his family, she set herself to claim it with a tenacity that would become the hallmark of her entire career. She fought for what was hers, this girl of 15 or 16, through the slow and tangled machinery of the law, and in the end she secured it, a small but a real and a lasting income drawn from the Barlow lands, the first independent property she had ever held in her own right. It was not much in itself, a modest portion from a modest estate, but it was hers, won and held against opposition, and it was the seed from which everything else would grow. We should pause and mark this moment well, for it tells us almost everything about the woman Bess was to become. Widowed as a child, with little in the world but her wits and her resolve, she did not weep and wait to be disposed of by others, as a more ordinary girl might have done. She went after the property that was her due, learned the legal weapons she would need, and fought a hard contest to a successful end. The instinct to secure, to claim, to hold fast to every right and every acre and every penny that the law allowed her, the instinct that would one day make her the richest woman in England after the Queen, is already fully present in this first small struggle over a young widow's jointure. She had grasped, young as she was, the central truth of her age and her sex, that for a woman without a fortune, property was the only real security and the only real power, and that what the law granted must be seized and guarded with unrelenting vigilance. It was a lesson. The straitened years of her childhood had prepared her to learn, and she had learned it perfectly, and from this first modest jointure, claimed by a fierce and a friendless girl, the complete towering edifice of her later wealth begins, in the end, to rise. So Bess emerges from her first marriage not as a broken or a defeated widow, but as something new and formidable. A woman, however young, with property of her own and a proven capacity to defend it. A person of small but real independence in an age that gave women very little of either. She was still young, still without great connection or great fortune, still a very long way from the heights she would one day reach. But she was no longer quite the helpless younger daughter she had been, for she had married and been widowed, and fought and won and come out of it with land in her own name and a hardness in her purpose that the contest had only sharpened. The first step had been taken, the first stone laid, and the widow, schooled now in loss and in law alike, turned her face once more toward the wider world and the larger chances that lay waiting in it. For her path was leading her, by ways she could not yet foresee, out of the narrow circle of the Derbyshire gentry, and toward the dazzling and dangerous centre of the whole kingdom, the court of the Tudor kings. And it is toward that glittering and perilous height that our story now begins to climb. In the years that followed the death of her first husband, the young widow Bess made her way by the patient arts of service and connection that she had already mastered, into grander households and wider circles than any she had known before, drawing steadily nearer to the very heart of the Tudor world. A capable and an agreeable gentlewoman, with property of her own and a growing reputation for sense and competence, was a useful person to have about a household, and she found places in establishments of rising consequence, attaching herself to families who moved in the orbit of the court and the council, the families who governed England and surrounded the throne. Among the connections she formed in these years were ties to some of the greatest people in the land, to families close to the crown itself, whose favour could lift a person of modest birth into rooms she could never otherwise have entered. And Bess, ever watchful, ever useful, ever charming, made the most of every such tie. She was climbing, by the only ladder open to a woman of her birth, the ladder of personal service and personal connection, making herself valued by people of power, and drawing herself, year by year, into the dazzling and the dangerous orbit of the Tudor great. It was a world utterly unlike the quiet gentry life of the Derbyshire hills, a place of immense wealth and immense peril, where fortunes were made and unmade at the turn of a king's mood, where the highest in the land might rise to dizzying splendour one year, and lose their heads upon the block the next. These were the later years of King Henry VIII, that vast and terrible figure whose reign had broken the old church, scattered the wealth of the monasteries amid his favourites, and taught the entire ruling class of England that everything, even life itself, was held at the pleasure of the crown, and the court around him was a place of glittering danger where ambition and terror walked hand in hand. Into the lower reaches of this world the young widow from Hardwick now came, not as one of its great figures, far from it, but as a useful and a trusted gentlewoman in the households that orbited it, close enough to feel its heat, and to learn its ways, and to begin to understand, with her shrewd and watchful mind, how power and wealth were truly won and held at the summit of the kingdom. She was serving the great, and studying them, and quietly preparing herself. For Bess was not merely drifting upward on the current of events, she was learning, always learning, the deeper workings of the world she meant to conquer. In these grander households she saw at close quarters how the truly powerful conducted their affairs, how they used marriage to bind families and fortunes together, how they acquired and held and passed on estates, how they navigated the treacherous waters of royal favour and political faction. She came to understand the immense importance of land above all, land as the true and the lasting foundation of all power and all standing in that age, the one possession that conferred real and durable greatness. And she watched how the grand families schemed and married and litigated to enlarge their holdings and secure them for their heirs. It was the most advanced and the most valuable education that her age could offer, this long apprenticeship in the ways of the powerful, and Bess absorbed it completely, fitting each new lesson into the growing structure of her own designs. She knew now far better than most how the game of greatness was played, and she was waiting only for the chance to play it on her own account. And in the natural course of her rise through these connected households, the young widow drew at last into the circle of the court itself, into the company of men and women who stood close to the very centre of power, who knew the king and served the council and shaped the destiny of the realm. For a woman of her birth it was a remarkable ascent already, from the obscure Manor of Hardwick to the antechambers of the great, accomplished in a handful of years by nothing but her own gifts and her own relentless application, and it placed her, now, within reach of the prize that would transform her existence. For it was among the people of this exalted world that she would find her second husband, a man as different from the sickly boy of her first marriage as could well be imagined, a man of wealth and standing, and real position at the very heart of the Tudor state. Through him she would make the leap from the fringes of greatness into its substance, acquiring at a stroke the fortune and the footing she had so been preparing herself to use. The girl from the hills had climbed within sight of the heights, and the man who would carry her up to them was waiting. That is exactly where our story goes next. The man who became the second husband of Bess was Sir William Cavendish, and he was, in nearly every particular, the opposite of the frail boy she had buried in her girlhood. Where Robert Barlow had been frail and sickly and poor, William Cavendish was a man well into his middle years, settled and seasoned and considerable, and above all he was rich, one of those shrewd and fortunate servants of the crown who had grown wealthy in the vast upheaval of Henry VIII's reign. He had risen through royal service to become Treasurer of the King's Chamber, a high financial office close to the heart of the government, and he had been among the men entrusted with the vast business of dissolving the monasteries and redistributing their immense wealth, a labour in which more than one royal servant had contrived to enrich himself handsomely. Cavendish had done very well indeed out of the age, acquiring lands and offices and a comfortable fortune, and he stood as a man of real consequence in the world, a knight and a royal official, with money and position and the ear of the powerful. He had been wed twice before, and was a widower when he met the Derbyshire widow, and in 1547, the year that the old king died and his boy son came to the throne, William Cavendish and Bess of Hardwick were wed. It was by any measure a brilliant match for the younger daughter of a straitened gentry house, a leap upward of the most dramatic kind, lifting her at a single stroke from the fringes of the mighty world into its solid and prosperous centre. She was now the wife of a wealthy royal official, mistress of his establishments, possessed through him of a share in a considerable fortune and a place in the society of the court. The obscure girl from the hills had married money and position, and wedded them well. But to see this marriage merely as a clever girl's capture of a rich old man would be to mistake it entirely, for everything we know suggests that it was beyond its undoubted advantages a true and a warm and a genuinely happy partnership. William Cavendish appears to have loved his young wife, and to have valued her not only for her charm, but for her remarkable head for business, treating her as a real partner in the management of their growing fortune, and she, for her part, seems to have given him a deep and a lasting affection, a regard that she carried for the rest of her long life. Of all her 4 husbands, it was Cavendish whose name she would keep closest to her heart, and Cavendish whose children would carry her blood and her ambition down the generations. The marriage that raised her was also, it seems, the marriage that she loved, and it was a partnership in the fullest and most practical sense, a joining not only of 2 people, but of 2 appetites for acquisition, for in William Cavendish Bess found a husband who shared her own deep passion for land and property and the work of a lasting estate. Together they set about enlarging and consolidating their holdings, buying and selling and exchanging lands with an energy and a shrewdness that marked them out even in that acquisitive age. And in this fine work Bess was no mere bystander, but an active and a driving force, her sharp financial mind fully engaged, her counsel sought and heeded by her husband. The skills she had been honing all her career, the head for figures, the grasp of law and property, the relentless instinct to secure and to hold, now found their full scope at last, applied to a fortune large enough to be worth the effort, and the 2 of them, husband and wife, laboured side by side at the congenial task of growing rich and grand. It was in these years as the partner of William Cavendish that she truly learned her trade as a manager of noble estates, serving a long apprenticeship in the very arts she would one day practice alone on a scale beyond all reckoning. She was being prepared by this happy and prosperous marriage for the towering independence that lay ahead. But the most consequential thing that Bess did as the wife of William Cavendish, the decision that shaped the rest of her days and the fortunes of her descendants for centuries, was to turn his eyes and his money northward, toward the hills of her own birth. For Cavendish's lands lay scattered, much of his property being in the southern counties, far from Derbyshire, and it was Bess, by all accounts, who persuaded him to sell those southern holdings, and to gather their fortune instead into a single concentration of land in her native county, in the countryside she had been born to and loved. It was a shrewd and a deeply characteristic stroke, this drawing of the Cavendish wealth back to her own county, rooting the Cavendish fortune in the soil of Bess's own beginnings, and it would prove, over the run of the centuries, one of the most far-sighted decisions in the whole history of her dynasty. The girl who had grown up a pinched and an anxious younger daughter on a small Derbyshire manor was now, as a wealthy wife, deliberately building her husband's fortune into an immense estate in that very same county, planting the seed of a dynasty in the ground of her own childhood. And at the centre of this new estate she meant to raise a hall worthy of it. That house was Chatsworth, and its founding is where we turn now. In the year 1549, William Cavendish, guided by his wife, bought the Manor of Chatsworth, a property in the valley of the River Derwent in the heart of Derbyshire, and there Bess began the first of the considerable building projects that would occupy and define so much of her days. For Bess of Hardwick was, before all her other titles and distinctions, a builder, a raiser of houses, a woman who expressed her ambition, and her wealth and her very self in stone and glass and timber, and Chatsworth was her first great work, the mansion in which she discovered and indulged that consuming passion. The old manor that stood on the site was not grand enough for her designs, and so she and Cavendish set about replacing it with a large and a handsome new house, built in the fashionable taste of the day, a fitting seat for the proud Derbyshire family they meant to found. The work would go on for many years, well beyond Cavendish's own lifetime, for the raising of a fine mansion was the toil of decades and not of seasons. But it was begun now, in these prosperous married years, and the Countess threw herself into it with the energy and the attention to detail that she brought to everything she undertook. She was, by nature and by passion, a builder, and at Chatsworth she found her vocation. It is worth dwelling for a moment on this passion for building, for it runs through the whole of Bess's life like a thread of gold, and it tells us much about the kind of woman she was. To build a noble seat in that age was to make a statement of the most public and the most lasting kind, a declaration in stone of one's wealth and one's standing and one's permanence. A fine house was the visible proof of a family's greatness, the seat from which it ruled its lands, and the monument by which it would be remembered. For a woman who had known the anxiety of fallen fortunes and fragile standing, there was surely a deep satisfaction in raising such solid and enduring proofs of her own success, in turning the wealth she had gathered into something massive and permanent and unmistakably hers. And there was, too, in Bess's work, a genuine love of the thing itself, a real delight in the planning and the contriving and the slow rising of a stately dwelling, in the choosing of designs and the management of craftsmen, and the 1,000 decisions that went into the making of a beautiful and an imposing home. She was an artist in her way, with stone and glass for her materials, and the lordly hall for her canvas, and Chatsworth was the first of her masterpieces, the seat where she learned the craft that she would one day carry to its highest pitch on the hill where she had been born. The Chatsworth that Bess began in these years was not the famous palace that stands on the site today, for that was the work of her descendants in a later age. It was an earlier house, grand by the measure of its own time, raised around courtyards in the manner of the day, large and richly appointed and splendidly sited in its Derbyshire valley. Into it Bess poured money and care and years of work, and around it she gathered the estate that her husband's redirected fortune had created, so that Chatsworth became the heart of the Cavendish lands, the seat of the family she was building. It was here that she would raise her children, here that she would weather the storms that lay ahead, here that she would establish herself as an imposing Derbyshire magnate in her own right, and though she would in the end build something even grander a few miles away, Chatsworth always held a special place in her long career, the first great mansion of her making, the foundation stone of her dynasty. The pinched younger daughter of the small manor had become the mistress of a rising palace, and she had made it in large part with her own vision and her own driving will. The house on the hill was answered, now by the dwelling in the valley, and the woman who had dreamed her way up from the one was making herself immortal in the other. And while the walls of Chatsworth rose, Bess was building something else as well, something even more important to her grand design, for in these prosperous married years she was bearing and raising the children who would carry her ambitions forward into the future. With William Cavendish, she had a house full of sons and daughters born across the years of their marriage, and these children were, to her, the very purpose and the crown of all her striving. For what was the point of gathering land and raising houses if not to found a house, a line of descent that would carry her blood and her name and her greatness down the generations? She was a dynast to the marrow, a founder of families, and her children were the living instruments of that founding, each one a precious asset to be reared and educated, and above all wed well, married upward, were wedded into the families of the realm so as to weave the Cavendish line into the very fabric of the nobility. From their earliest years she watched over them with a fierce and a calculating devotion, planning their futures, guarding their interests, determined that every one of them should rise as high as cleverness and money and marriage could carry them. The children of Bess were born to be the founders of dynasties, and their mother never for a moment let them, or herself, forget it. Her eldest surviving son, Henry, and after him the others, William and Charles, and her daughters too, Frances and Elizabeth and Mary, grew up at Chatsworth and in the other houses of the family as the heirs of a grand and a rising fortune, raised in the expectation of greatness, and trained for the parts their mother meant them to play. She spared no effort and no expense upon them, for they were her future made flesh. She secured for them the most advantageous connections. Standing as godparents to her children were some of the greatest people in the land, a sign of how high the Cavendishes had already climbed. and she planned with the patient calculation that marked all her schemes, the marriages that would carry her children into the nobility and bind her line to the grand halls of England. It would take many years for these designs to come to their full fruition, and not all of them would unfold as she hoped. But the ambition was there from the start, vast and clear and unwavering, the determination to make of her children the founders of noble lines. And in this, the deepest of all her ambitions, she would in the end succeed beyond her wildest imagining, for from the children she bore to William Cavendish would descend dukes and earls without number, vast families that endure in the very first rank of the English nobility to this day. The dynasty she dreamed of was being born in the nurseries of Chatsworth, and it would outlast every stone she ever laid. But the happy and prosperous years of her marriage to William Cavendish were not destined to last, for in the year 1557, after a decade of partnership, Cavendish died, and she found herself a widow once again, this time not a friendless girl, but a woman of property, and standing with a house full of children and a mighty estate to defend. The loss of Cavendish was a heavy blow, the parting from a husband she had truly loved and laboured beside for 10 full years. But Bess had little leisure to grieve, for his death plunged her almost at once into a crisis that threatened to undo everything they had created together. For William Cavendish, the treasurer of the King's Chamber, had died owing a very large sum of money to the Crown, his official accounts found to be in a vast deficit, whether through the rough and ready financial practices of the age, or through some irregularity, or through simple misfortune, no one could now say for certain. And the Crown, in the way of governments, wanted its money, and it looked to the dead man's estate, and to his widow, to make good the enormous debt. It was a moment of real and serious danger, for the sum demanded was vast, large enough to swallow the entire fortune that Bess and her husband had so carefully assembled, to break up the noble estate, to bring down Chatsworth itself, and beggar the children for whom she had planned such greatness. A lesser woman might have been crushed by it, might have surrendered the estate and accepted ruin, but Bess of Hardwick was not a woman to be crushed, and she met this crisis as she had met every challenge of her life, with courage and cunning and an unrelenting fight. She set herself to defend her dynasty's fortune against the demands of the Crown, deploying every weapon that law and connection and sheer dogged persistence could provide, petitioning and negotiating and contriving, working to reduce the debt, to delay its payment, to protect the heart of the estate from being seized. It was the kind of long, grinding, intricate struggle over money and property at which she excelled, and she threw the whole force of her formidable will into it, for she was fighting now for the very survival of everything she had erected, for Chatsworth and the lands and the future of her children. The widow stood alone against the Crown, with her whole world in the balance, and she did not flinch. She would in time prevail in this struggle, as she prevailed in nearly every struggle she ever entered, holding the estate together and preserving the inheritance of her children against all the pressure that the Crown could bring. But the contest was long and hard, and far from finished at her husband's death, and it cast a shadow of anxiety over her widowhood. Once again, as in her childhood and in her first widowhood, she was made to feel how precarious even a fortune could be, how swiftly the ground could open beneath the feet of those who seemed most securely placed, and once again the lesson only hardened her resolve to gather and to secure and to hold. She was a woman of substance now, a wealthy widow with an immense estate, but she was also a woman besieged, fighting to keep what she had won, and into this fraught and demanding situation, with the Crown's debt hanging over her and her children's future in doubt, there came, before very long, the man who would become her third husband, and who would help her to weather the storm. His name was Sir William Stillow, and he was a very considerable catch indeed. For the England into which she was now widowed was a changed and a changing place. For the old king's sickly son had died young, and his elder daughter Mary had reigned and died in her turn, and now a new sovereign sat upon the throne, the Queen Elizabeth, whose long and glorious reign was just beginning. And Sir William Saintlow was one of the new queen's most trusted and most favoured servants, the captain of her guard, the man charged with the personal safety of the sovereign herself, a position of the highest confidence and honour. He was also a wealthy West Country gentleman, possessed of broad lands and a sizable fortune of his own. For the widowed Bess to attach such a man was a triumph of the first order, carrying her into the innermost circle of the new reign, and joining her fortune to that of a rich and a powerful courtier at the very moment when she most needed a strong ally. And attach him she did, for the two were married around the year 1559, in the early days of the new queen's rule. Through Saintlow, Bess gained not only wealth and protection, but a place close to the throne of the woman who would dominate her age. The girl from Hardwick was now the wife of the captain of the Queen's Guard, and Saintlow, like Cavendish before him, seems to have loved her dearly, and to have used his wealth and his influence freely in her service, helping her in her fight against the Crown's debt, and lending her the shelter of his powerful position. Saintlow proved a devoted and a generous husband, and the marriage, though it would not last long, brought Bess a period of security and high favour, such as she had not known before. He was wealthy, he was powerful, he stood high in the regard of the Queen, and he placed all of it at the disposal of his formidable wife, easing her financial troubles and advancing her standing at court. He appears, indeed, to have been quite devoted to her, treating her children as his own, and showing every sign of a deep and a settled affection. For Bess it was a marriage of solid advantage and real comfort, joining her to a good and a powerful man at a difficult moment, and lifting her higher still in the world. And under his protection she consolidated her position, strengthened her estate, and drew nearer than ever to the centre of power. But the marriage carried within it, all unsuspected, the seeds of a dark and a dramatic turn, for Sir William Saintlow had a younger brother named Edward, and Edward Saintlow was a man of very bad character, grasping and unscrupulous, who looked with a covetous and a resentful eye upon his brother's wealth and his brother's marriage. And in his early death, which came after only a few years of marriage, there would be a whisper of something very sinister indeed. The marriage to Sir William Saintlow lasted only a handful of years, for he died around the middle of the 1560s, while still in the prime of his service to the Queen, and the manner of his death has carried down the centuries a faint but a persistent breath of suspicion. For his younger brother Edward, that grasping and unscrupulous man, had every reason to wish him gone, standing as he did to gain by his brother's death, and resenting bitterly the wealth that flowed instead toward Bess. And Edward Saintlow was a man of evil reputation, who had already been suspected in other matters of reaching for poison to clear his path. Whether he truly had a hand in his brother's death no one can now prove, and we should be cautious of laying so dark a charge with certainty across so great a distance of time. But the rumour was there in the age itself, the whisper that Sir William Saintlow had been poisoned by his own brother, and it has clung to his memory ever since. What is certain is that he died, and that he died having made his wife the chief beneficiary of his fortune, for Sir William Saintlow, devoted to Bess to the last, had settled his wealth upon her in preference to his brother, and even to his own daughters of an earlier marriage. By his death, whatever its true cause, she was made richer and more independent than she had ever been. This was the inheritance that lifted the Countess into the very first rank of wealthy widows in England, for to the fortune she had built with Cavendish was now added the considerable wealth of Saintlow, settled upon her absolutely, and held in her own right. And a wealthy widow, in that age, was very nearly the freest and the most powerful that a woman could be. She was no longer dependent upon any man, no longer a wife subject to a husband's will, but a landowner and a woman of fortune in her own person, mistress of her estates and her money and her own decisions, answerable to no one. For a woman of Bess's gifts and ambitions, this independence was a thing of immense value, the platform from which she could at last act fully on her own account. And she used it, in the years that followed, to consolidate and enlarge her holdings, to press forward the raising at Chatsworth, and to advance the careers and the marriages of her growing children. She had climbed by 3 marriages from the obscure manor of her birth to the position of one of the richest women in the kingdom, and now, free and wealthy and formidable, she stood ready for the greatest leap of all. For there remained one more rung on the ladder, one final marriage that would carry her from the ranks of the wealthy gentry into the very highest nobility of the land. The man who would raise her there was the greatest she had yet drawn to her side. Nedger? George Talbot, the 6th Earl of Shrewsbury, was one of the mightiest noblemen in all of England, the head of an ancient and an immensely powerful family, the master of vast estates spread across the Midlands and the North, an imposing magnate who ruled over wide territories like a prince and stood among the foremost peers of the realm. To marry such a man was to enter the highest circle of the kingdom, the small charmed company of the nobility who stood just below the throne itself. And it was this towering match that Bess of Hardwick, the younger daughter of a small Derbyshire manor, now achieved, for around the year 1567, she and the Earl of Shrewsbury were wed, and Bess became, at the summit of her long climb, the Countess of Shrewsbury. It was an astonishing destination for a life that had begun in such obscurity, a rise across the entire vast distance of the social order, from the lesser gentry to the grand nobility, accomplished by one woman in the span of her own lifetime through nothing but her gifts, her resolve, and her 4 well-chosen marriages. The girl who had been a charge upon a straitened household, married off as a child to a sickly neighbour, was now a countess, the wife of one of the greatest lords in England, mistress of a clutch of splendid houses, and a partner in one of the largest fortunes in the land. The climb was complete. Bess had reached the heights, and being Bess, she did not enter this great marriage without securing it cleverly for the future of her own children, for the union of herself and the Earl was sealed by a further and a most characteristic stroke, a double marriage that bound the Cavendish blood directly into the Grand Hall of Talbot, for on the same occasion, or near to it, 2 of Bess's Cavendish children were wed to 2 of the Earl's Talbot children, her daughter Mary Cavendish to the Earl's heir, and her son Henry Cavendish to the Earl's daughter, so that the 2 families were knit together, not by one marriage but by 3. And the children of the obscure Hardwick girl were planted firmly within the highest nobility. It was a masterstroke of dynastic calculation, this double match, for it ensured that Bess's own descendants, and not merely she herself, would share in the greatness of the Talbot connection. Her grandchildren, springing from these unions, would carry the blood of one of the premier earldoms of England. She never married merely for herself. She wedded always for her line, for the founding of the mighty families she meant to leave behind her, and even at the very summit of her own success, she was busy securing the advancement of her children and her children's children. The Countess of Shrewsbury had arrived at the top of the realm, and she had brought her dynasty up with her. For a time the great marriage seems to have been happy enough, a grand partnership of 2 formidable and acquisitive people, at the very height of the kingdom, but very soon a circumstance entered their lives that would strain the union to breaking and beyond, and that would place the Earl and Countess of Shrewsbury at the very centre of the most dangerous business of the age. For in the year 1569, the Earl of Shrewsbury was given a charge of the gravest and the most delicate kind, a responsibility that would dominate the next 15 years of his existence and his marriage. He was made the keeper of Mary, Queen of Scots. The Scottish Queen, driven from her own kingdom by rebellion and scandal, had fled across the border into England the year before, throwing herself upon the mercy of her cousin Queen Elizabeth, and there she had become at once the most awkward and the most perilous guest in the realm, a captive queen with a claim of her own to the English throne, a magnet for every Catholic plot, and every disaffected schemer in the kingdom. Elizabeth could neither free her, nor restore her, nor in the end quite bring herself to destroy her, and so the Scottish Queen must be held, securely and honourably, in a kind of comfortable imprisonment, kept safe and kept watched, year after year. And the nobleman chosen to bear this heavy and dangerous honour was the Earl of Shrewsbury, the husband of Bess. So it was that for some 15 years Mary, Queen of Scots, was held in the keeping of the Earl and Countess of Shrewsbury, lodged in one after another of their fine mansions, a royal prisoner beneath their roof and in their charge. It was an honour of the highest kind, this trust to guard a queen, a sign of the immense confidence that Elizabeth placed in Shrewsbury's loyalty and standing. But it was also a burden almost beyond bearing, a crushing weight of expense and anxiety and ceaseless vigilance that pressed upon the household for year after weary year. The captive queen could not be lodged like an ordinary prisoner, but must be kept in a state befitting her royal rank, with her own household of attendants, her own furnishings and comforts and dignity, all of it at the Shrewsbury's charge, and she must at the same time be guarded with unrelenting care, watched and confined and protected against the endless plots that swirled about her. For if she should escape, or be rescued, or be the centre of a successful conspiracy, the ruin of her keeper would be certain. The Queen of Scots was moved between the Shrewsbury houses as security and circumstance required, to Tutbury and to Sheffield, to Wingfield and to Chatsworth itself, and to the waters of Buxton when her health required them. And wherever she went, the burden of her keeping went with her, draining the Earl's fortune and fraying the nerves of his domestic establishment across the years. For Bess, the presence of the Scottish Queen in her houses was a strange and a fateful thing, drawing her into a close and a peculiar intimacy with one of the most famous and most tragic figures of the age. The two women were thrown much together across these years, the captive queen and the countess, who was her hostess and her jailer both, and between them there grew, for a period at least, a real and a curious companionship, born of the long idle hours of a shared confinement. They were both women of strong character and considerable accomplishment, lodged together for years in the noble seats of Derbyshire, and they found in one another, for a while, a kind of company, and above all they shared the absorbing labour of needlework, sitting together hour upon hour with their threads and their frames, working the elaborate embroideries that were the pastime of noble women in that age. There is something deeply poignant in the picture of these two extraordinary women, the doomed queen and the self-made countess, bending side by side over their needlework in the firelit chambers of Chatsworth and Sheffield, stitching their intricate patterns through the slow years of the captivity, two of the most remarkable women of their century brought together by the strangest of chances, and passing the time, as women had always done, with the quiet, companionable work of the needle. The embroideries that came from these years, worked by the Queen and the Countess and the women of their households, survive in part to this day, intricate panels and hangings rich with flowers and beasts and emblems and devices, the patient handiwork of those long captive hours, and they are a moving relic of that strange shared confinement, the threads that two famous women drew through the cloth in the firelight of a Derbyshire winter, 4 centuries and more ago. For the captive queen, the needlework was a solace and an occupation in the empty stretch of her imprisonment, a way to fill the endless hours and to work, sometimes, small coded messages of her defiance and her hope into the patterns. For she, It was the familiar and beloved effort of her sex, and a means perhaps of drawing close to the royal prisoner who had been so strangely placed in her care. We should not sentimentalise the bond too far, for it had its limits and its wariness, the Countess being always, beneath the companionship, the keeper of a dangerous prisoner and the loyal subject of the Queen who held her. But for a time, in the early years of the captivity, there seems to have been a genuine warmth between the two women, an unlikely friendship stitched together over the embroidery frames. It is one of the most curious and most touching episodes in the entirety of Bess's long life, this needlework companionship with a captive queen. But the captivity of the Scottish Queen, with all its burdens and its tensions, proved in the end to be poison to the marriage of the Earl and Countess of Shrewsbury, and as the years wore on their union began to crack and crumble, and at last to break apart in bitterness. The strains upon it were many, and they fed upon one another. The crushing financial burden of the Queen's keeping, the constant anxiety and confinement of an establishment built around a royal prisoner, and above all the clash of two strong and acquisitive natures over the great question that ran through all of Bess's life, the question of money and property. For Bess, ever the dynast, was relentless in advancing the interests of her own Cavendish children, and in securing for them and for herself every advantage that the considerable Talbot fortune could yield, and the Earl came to resent, more and more bitterly, what he saw as his wife's grasping and her favouring of her own blood over his. They quarrelled long and hard and publicly over lands and money and the disposition of their estates, and the quarrels grew into a bitter and a scandalous breach. And into this poisoned situation Bess introduced, whether from jealousy or from calculation or from some mixture of both, a charge of the most damaging and most dangerous kind, for she put about the rumour that her husband the Earl had grown far too intimate with his beautiful captive, that there was something improper between the keeper and the Queen of Scots. It was a deadly thing to whisper, touching as it did upon the Earl's honour and his loyalty and the security of the whole realm, and it wounded Shrewsbury to the quick and enraged him beyond forgiveness. Whether Bess believed it, or whether she spread it as a weapon in their war over property, we cannot now say, but it did its work of destruction upon what remained of the marriage. The breach between the Earl and Countess became open and notorious, a great scandal that drew in the entire court, and at last the Queen herself, for Elizabeth was forced to intervene between her overmighty subjects, to attempt again and again to reconcile the warring pair. But the reconciliations never held, and the marriage that had carried Bess to the summit of the nobility ended in a long, bitter public estrangement, the Earl and Countess living apart, locked in endless disputes over money, until Shrewsbury's death at last released them both. The greatest of her marriages had become the unhappiest, but the Countess, as always, would emerge from the wreckage with her fortune not diminished but enlarged, with her marriage to the Earl in ruins, and the two of them living bitterly apart. She turned her energies, as she always did in trouble, toward the thing she loved best in all the realm, the construction of stately dwellings, and it was in these years of estrangement, and after the Earl's death in the year 1590, of wealthy widowhood, that she raised the masterpiece that would crown her career and carry her name down the centuries. For Bess now returned in the fullness of her years and her fortune to the very place of her birth, to Hardwick, the small manor among the Derbyshire slopes where she had come into the world so long before as the obscure younger daughter of a straitened gentry house. The old family estate had passed, through misfortune, out of the hands of her brother's line, and she, with the memory and the deep instinct of her kind, had bought it back, reclaiming the ground of her beginnings, and there, on the hill of her birth, she set about work not one fine mansion but two. First she enlarged and transformed the existing manor, the building we now call the Old Hall, raising it into a tall and an imposing dwelling. And then, when the Earl's death poured fresh wealth into her hands, she began, close beside it, an entirely new and far grander house, the one that the world knows as Hardwick Hall. The building of Hardwick Hall, between about 1590 and 1597, was the supreme achievement of Bess's career as a builder, the full and final flowering of the passion that had begun at Chatsworth more than 40 years before. To raise it, she employed the finest architectural talent of the age, the designer Robert Smithson, the master builder, whose genius shaped some of the most remarkable houses of Elizabethan England. And between the vision of Sisson and the will and the wealth of the Countess there arose on the Derbyshire hilltop, one of the wonders of English building, a mansion unlike anything that had been seen before. For Hardwick Hall was, above all things, a house of glass, its walls pierced with windows of a size and a number that astonished the age, imposing sheets of glass rising tier upon tier up the tall facades, so that the house seemed less a thing of stone than a glittering lantern set upon the hill. Glass was a costly luxury in that century, a material that proclaimed the wealth of whoever could afford it in abundance, and the Countess used it with a lavishness that was itself a kind of boast, and so was born the famous saying that has clung to the seat ever after, that Hardwick Hall is more glass than wall. It was a marvel and a wonder. This shining creation, the boldest possible declaration in stone and glass of the greatness of the woman who had raised it. And lest anyone should forget whose it was, she set her own mark upon it in the most emphatic way imaginable. She crowned the 6 tall towers of Hardwick Hall with her own initials, carved in stone openwork against the sky, the letters E and S, standing for Elizabeth Shrewsbury, the Countess who had raised it. There they stand to this day, high above the countryside, the vast stone initials of Bess of Hardwick, proclaiming across the centuries the name and the triumph of the woman who raised the house beneath them, and there can be few more eloquent monuments to a mighty ambition than those letters cut against the sky, the self-made magnate signing her masterpiece in stone for all the ages to see. It was an act of supreme self-assertion, this crowning of the towers with her own initials, the gesture of a woman who had climbed from nothing to the very heights and meant the world to know it, and it was wholly characteristic of Bess, who had spent her whole life turning her wealth into solid and lasting and unmistakable proofs of her own greatness. The girl from the small manor had made, upon the hill of her birth, a shining palace crowned with her own name, and she had made certain it would stand and speak for her long after she herself was gone. The house that Bess built upon the hill was not merely a marvel of glass and stone without, for within it was as splendid and as carefully contrived as any house in England, a setting fit for the great magnate she had become. The visitor who entered Hardwick Hall climbed by a noble stone staircase that rose grandly through the heart of the hall toward the splendid staterooms on the upper floors, the arrangement deliberately drawing the eye and the feet upward toward magnificence. And at the summit lay the 2 showpieces of the mansion, the high great chamber and the long gallery, among the most celebrated interiors of their age. The high great chamber was the grand room of state, where Bess received her most honoured guests in something approaching royal ceremony, its walls crowned with an immense painted and moulded frieze running around the whole chamber, a band of figures and forests and hunting scenes in coloured plaster. It was a room designed to overwhelm and to impress, the throne room, as it were, of the uncrowned Queen of Derbyshire. And beyond it ran the long gallery, one of the longest and most magnificent in England, a vast bright corridor of a room stretching nearly the entire length of the dwelling, lit by its enormous windows and hung with tapestries and with portraits, a place for walking and display, and the parade of the family's greatness. Everywhere within the house, she gathered the rich and beautiful things that proclaimed her wealth and her standing, the tapestries and the embroideries and the painted cloths, The carved furniture and the plasterwork and the heraldic devices, all of it composed into a single overwhelming statement of magnificence. She hung the walls with considerable tapestries bought at vast expense, some of them adapted to her purpose with her own arms and initials worked into them. She filled the rooms with the products of years of acquisition and of the patient needlework of her own household. She set her emblems and her initials and her devices everywhere through the hall, so that the whole edifice proclaimed, in 100 ways, the identity and the triumph of its builder. Hardwick Hall was, in the end, a kind of portrait of Bess herself, rendered in glass and stone and tapestry, a complete and a deliberate expression of everything she had become. It was the autobiography of a self-made magnate, written across a hilltop in the most expensive materials the age could provide. No one who saw it could doubt that here lived a person of immense wealth and immense will, a great figure who had made herself by her own efforts and who meant her greatness to endure. It was a mansion erected not only to be lived in, but to be remembered. And remembered it has been for more than 400 years. Nor did the splendour end at the walls, for a seat of such pretension was set within gardens and courts and walks laid out to match it, the ground about it shaped and planted to flatter the building that rose from its midst. Below the tall, bright windows there were walled enclosures and gravelled paths, knots of clipped herbs and low hedges set out in careful patterns, beds of the flowers that an Elizabethan gentlewoman prized and grew and dried for her still-room. There were orchards heavy in their season, with apples and pears and plums, and warm sheltered corners where tender things could be coaxed along, and broad green walks where the family might take the air and survey their domain. A garden in that age was itself a kind of statement, an ordered piece of nature bent to the will of its maker, costly to lay out and costlier still to keep. And the gardens about her houses were part of the whole grand composition by which she declared her standing. There was use in them as well as show, for the beds yielded the herbs that flavoured the cooking and physic the household, the orchards their fruit, the warm walls their early crops, the pleasure ground and the kitchen ground ran together, beauty and provision side by side, as they did in every well-ordered seat of that century. And to step out from the bright glittering rooms into the green quiet of the walks, with the tall towers rising at one's back and the open country falling away beyond the hedges, was to pass from one of Bess's creations into another, for she had shaped the ground as surely as she had shaped the stone. But the noble seat, however magnificent, was never quite the whole of Bess's ambition, for she was a dynast above all things, and the deepest of her hopes in these final years was fixed not upon stone, but upon a living girl, her granddaughter Arbella Stuart, in whom the most dazzling and the most dangerous of all her dreams seemed to take shape. For Arbella was no ordinary grandchild. She carried in her veins the blood of kings, and a claim, by some reckonings, to the throne of England itself. She was the child of Bess's daughter Elizabeth Cavendish, and of Charles Stuart, the Earl of Lennox, a young nobleman who stood close to the royal line, being descended, as was Arbella through him, from Margaret Tudor, the elder sister of King Henry VIII. And that descent gave Arbella a place in the tangled succession to the childless Queen Elizabeth, a seat near enough to the throne to make her, in the eyes of many, a possible heir to the crown of England. Both of Arbella's young parents died while she was still a small child, and so the child was given into the keeping of her formidable grandmother, and raised at Hardwick under the close and watchful eye of Bess, and she, gazing upon this granddaughter of royal blood, allowed herself to dream the highest dream of all. For if Arbella should one day be named the heir, and come at last to the throne, then she, the younger daughter of a small Derbyshire manor, would be the grandmother of a Queen of England. It was a vision to dazzle even so practised an ambition as Bess's, and she nursed it with all the care and all the calculation of her nature, raising Arbella as a princess in waiting, educating her finely, guarding her jealously, and watching over her royal prospects with a fierce and an anxious devotion. But the dream was as perilous as it was dazzling, for a girl with a claim to the throne was a piece in the most dangerous game in the kingdom, a focus for plots and ambitions and the deep suspicion of the crown, and to raise such a girl, and to scheme for her advancement, was to walk a knife edge above an abyss. Queen Elizabeth, aging and childless and intensely wary of any who might be positioned to succeed her, watched the granddaughter of Bess with a cold and a jealous eye, and any sign that Arbella was being groomed for the throne, or married in a way that might strengthen her claim, was certain to bring down the anger of the crown. She thus found herself, in her old age, the keeper of a dangerous treasure, a granddaughter whose royal blood was at once her family's most glittering asset and its gravest peril, and the guarding of Arbella became one of the central preoccupations of her final years. So Bess kept the child close at Hardwick, watched over and guarded, and as the years passed and Arbella grew restless under so tight a rein, very nearly confined, for the granddaughter, raised in such splendid isolation and dangled before so dazzling and so forbidden a prospect, grew increasingly unhappy and unstable under the weight of it all. Arbella chafed against the control of her domineering grandmother, longed for a freedom and a future of her own, and was drawn, as such a girl might well be, toward desperate schemes to escape her gilded cage and to settle her own fate. And in the last years of the old Queen's reign, there came a dangerous crisis, when Arbella attempted, in secret and in defiance, to arrange a marriage for herself, a match that might have had the gravest implications for the succession. The plot was discovered and came to nothing, but it threw the establishment into turmoil and brought the anxious scrutiny of the government down upon Hardwick, and it showed how perilous the entire business of Arbella had become. For the dream of a crowned granddaughter was never to be realized. When the old Queen Elizabeth at last died, the throne passed not to Arbella, but to her cousin, the King of Scots, the son of that very Queen of Scots whom Bess had once helped to guard. Arbella's royal hopes faded, and her later life, beyond the scope of our story tonight, would end in tragedy and imprisonment. But through all the dangerous years of Arbella's youth, Bess had watched and guarded and schemed, playing for the highest stakes of all, with a queen's crown glittering just out of reach, at the end of her long ambition. Through all these years of building and dynastic scheming, she remained what she had always been at bottom, a businesswoman of formidable gifts, the shrewd and tireless manager of a vast and a growing fortune. And it is worth pausing to look at her in this, the role that underlay all the rest. For the houses she built and the marriages she made, and the dreams she nursed all rested upon money, upon the accumulation of land and wealth that she had been assembling all her days and that she managed in her later years with a mastery that few men of her age could have matched. She was the mistress of broad estates spread across Derbyshire and beyond, and she ran them with a close and a vigilant attention, overseeing her lands and her tenants and her revenues, driving hard bargains, pursuing every advantage, keeping her accounts with a meticulous and an unflagging care. She drew wealth not only from her farms, but from the riches beneath her land, from the coal and the lead and the other minerals of the Derbyshire uplands, and from a whole range of enterprises, for she was ever alert to a new source of profit, and she lent money too, at interest, becoming a creditor to many and adding the returns of finance to the rents of her estates. The girl who had learned to keep a household's accounts in a small manner had become the chief executive, as we might say, of an imposing commercial and landed enterprise, and she governed it with an iron grip. It was this relentless and capable management, sustained across decade after decade, that made the Countess one of the richest people in all of England, second among the women of the realm only to the Queen herself, and her fortune was the more remarkable for having been built, in such large part, by her own efforts and her own gifts. She had married well, 4 times over, and each marriage had brought her wealth, but she had not merely inherited her riches, she had grown them, managed them, multiplied them, turning each fortune that came to her into the foundation of a greater one, never resting, never letting slip an advantage, never ceasing to gather and to build and to secure. There was in her a tireless engine of acquisition that ran on, undimmed into her old age, a deep need to accumulate that the anxieties of her childhood had perhaps first set going, and that nothing in her life of success ever quite stilled. She was a magnate, a builder of houses and dynasties, a player in the perilous game of the succession. But she was also, always and to the end, a woman of business, watching her accounts by candlelight, driving her bargains, ruling her estates, the shrewdest and the most formidable manager of money that her age produced among her sex. And her wealth was the rock on which all the rest was raised. And so we come to Bess in her grand old age, an old woman now, full of years and full of wealth, ruling her glittering house of glass upon the hill like a queen in her own small kingdom. She had outlived all 4 of her husbands, outlasted the captive Queen of Scots, and very nearly the great Queen Elizabeth too, and she presided in her final years over the vast estate and the splendid houses she had spent a lifetime assembling, a grand and a formidable matriarch at the summit of everything she had striven for. Hardwick Hall was finished now, and Bess dwelt within it in mighty state, surrounded by her servants and her treasures, the absolute mistress of her household and her lands, governing all with the same close and controlling will that had carried her so far. She kept her domestic establishment to a strict and an ordered round, watched over her accounts and her work and her affairs as keenly as ever, and ruled her line with a firm and sometimes a harsh hand, for she was not always an easy woman to her children, quarrelling bitterly at times with one or another of them over money and inheritance, as strong-willed and as exacting in her dynastic dealings as in all else. She had reached the heights, and she held them with an unrelenting grip, but there was a loneliness, perhaps, in that high cold splendour, the solitude of a fine old woman who had outlived so much and controlled so fiercely and trusted, in the end, so few. Yet if there was solitude in her old age, there was also an immense and a hard-won satisfaction, the deep contentment of a life's vast ambition, very nearly wholly fulfilled. She could look out from the noble windows of her house of glass, across a wide sweep of land that was largely her own, the lands she had gathered, the houses she had raised, the visible monument of her own astonishing rise. She could reflect that she had climbed from the obscurest of beginnings to the very summit of wealth and standing, that she had founded a dynasty that was already taking its place among the families of the realm, that her name and her initials were carved in stone against the sky for all the ages to read. Few people in any age have achieved so completely the things they set out to achieve, or made so solid and so lasting a monument to their own will and their own labour. And she, in her old age at Hardwick, could survey the whole immense structure of her life's work, and know that it was good and that it would endure. She had spent her long years in ceaseless striving, and the striving had not been in vain. She had made herself, by her own gifts and her own relentless will, one of the greatest figures of her age. And now in the glass tower on the hill of her birth, the old countess waited out her final years in the midst of her triumph, the child from the small manor grown old and rich and mighty, the architect of her own extraordinary destiny. The long and extraordinary life of Bess of Hardwick came at last to its close in the February of the year 1608, when the old countess, full of years and honours and wealth beyond a reckoning of her birth, died in the stately house of glass that she had raised upon the hill of her beginnings. She was by then a very old woman indeed, some 80 years of age or thereabouts, having outlived not only her 4 husbands, but very nearly the entirety of the realm into which she had been born. The old Queen Elizabeth was 5 years dead, and a new king sat upon the throne, and the England of Bess's girlhood, with its monasteries and its boy king, and its terrible old tyrant Henry, had passed away into history while she lived on. She had seen the entire vast span of the Tudor century, from the reign of the 8th Henry to the coming of the Stuart kings, and she had climbed across the whole of it from the bottom of the gentry to the summit of the nobility, and now, in the glass tower of Hardwick, surrounded by the treasures and the splendour she had spent a lifetime gathering, she came to the end of her remarkable road. There is a kind of fitness in it that she should have died at Hardwick, on the very ground where she had been born so long before, the wheel of her life come full circle from the small manor to the lordly hall that had risen beside it. Bess met her end as she had met everything else in her existence, with foresight and with a careful ordering of her affairs, for she had long since made provision for her death with the same meticulous attention that she brought to every other piece of business. She had drawn up a detailed will, disposing of her vast fortune and her great mansions according to her own settled designs, taking care, as ever, to advance and to secure the line she had laboured so to found, and she had even, with the characteristic far-sightedness of one who left nothing to chance, arranged for her own great tomb to be made during her own lifetime, so that she might be certain of the manner of her remembrance. For Bess was to be buried not at Hardwick, but in the town of Derby, in the great church there, and over her grave she had caused to be raised a splendid monument, a fine and an imposing tomb fit for the proud magnate she had become, with her effigy laid upon it in her countess's robes. It stands there still, in what is now the Cathedral of Derby, the carved image of Bess of Hardwick keeping its silent stone vigil over the place of her rest, the final monument of a woman who had spent her whole life raising monuments to herself, and there can be few more telling proofs of her character than this, that she should have erected and inspected her own tomb before she died, determined to control even the manner of her memory. When the will was read, and the fortune disposed, it became clear how completely the Countess had shaped, even from beyond the grave, the future of the dynasty she had founded, for she had gathered her vast wealth and her splendid houses into the hands of the children and the line she most favoured, and so set her dynasty firmly upon its course. The disposal of her fortune was a matter of the gravest consequence, for it was an immense inheritance, one of the largest fortunes in private hands in all of England, in land and houses and money and treasure, and the manner in which she divided it among her descendants would shape the fortunes of imposing families for generations to come. She had her favourites among her children, as we shall see, and her will reflected the loves and the disappointments and the calculations of a long life. She rewarded the loyal and the capable, and passed over the disappointing, channeling the bulk of her greatness toward the son. She trusted to carry it forward. And in this final act of dynastic engineering, this last disposal of all she had won, the Countess set the seal upon her career's true purpose, the founding of enduring families, for the wealth she had spent a lifetime gathering would not be scattered at her death, but would pass, concentrated and secure, into the hands of those who would build upon it. The old Countess died, but the dynasty she had made lived on, and would flourish beyond anything even she had dared to dream. To understand the inheritance that the Countess left behind, we must turn to look more closely at her children, the sons and daughters she had borne to William Cavendish so long before, for they were the living vessels of all her ambition, and their fates were the proof of her success, and the occasion, too, of some of her deepest disappointments. They were a varied brood, as children always are, and they did not all of them please her, for the Countess was an exacting and a demanding parent, and she measured her children by the high and the unforgiving standard of her own driving ambition. Her eldest son Henry was the chief of her disappointments, a man who fell far short of his mother's hopes, given to extravagance and to loose living, scattering his substance and his affections widely, and quite without the steady gathering, dynastic seriousness that the Countess prized above all things, and she came in the end to mistrust and to disfavour him, turning the bulk of her inheritance away from her eldest son and toward a younger and a worthier. It is a hard thing to be the disappointing child of a grand and a demanding parent, and Henry Cavendish seems to have worn that unhappy part. The heir who could not measure up passed over at the last in favour of his brother. But she was never sentimental in matters of business, even the business of her own family, and she gave her greatness to the child she judged most fit to keep it. That child was her second son, William Cavendish, who was the favourite of her later years and the chief heir of her fortune, and in whom she found the steady, capable, acquisitive temperament that answered to her own. To him she gave the grand halls of Hardwick and Chatsworth, and the bulk of her vast estate, making him the chief inheritor of all her greatness. And William proved worthy of the trust, a careful and a considerable man who built upon his mother's foundation and rose in time to the highest honours. For it was William Cavendish who became the first Earl of Devonshire, the founder of that great line of Cavendish earls, and in later generations, the Dukes of Devonshire, who hold Chatsworth to this day and stand among the foremost families in the entire nobility of England. From Bess, through her favoured son, descends one of the very greatest of English dynasties, a dynasty of immense wealth and high distinction that has endured for more than 4 centuries, and that traces its origin and its first mighty fortune to the will and the toil of the girl from the small Derbyshire manor. Her dearest ambition, the founding of an enduring noble line, was realised through this son beyond all expectation. The Devonshire dynasty is, in a real sense, her monument as surely as Hardwick Hall itself. Nor was the line of Devonshire the only great dynasty that sprang from Bess, for her third son Charles Cavendish founded a dynasty scarcely less illustrious, the line that would become the Dukes of Newcastle. Charles was a man of taste and of building in his mother's own mould, who acquired estates of his own and began the raising of fine houses, and from him descended that William Cavendish, who became the noble Duke of Newcastle, a famous figure of a later age, a builder and a horseman and a loyal servant of his king. Through Charles, then, she founded a second ducal line, so that 2 of the dynasties of the English nobility, Devonshire and Newcastle alike, trace their descent and their first fortunes to her, and her daughters, too, were then to families of consequence, and carried her blood into yet further branches of the nobility. Her daughter Mary, married to the heir of the Earl of Shrewsbury, became in time a countess in her own right, but other daughters allied themselves with families of standing, spreading the Cavendish connection ever wider through the ranks of the great. From the womb of Bess sprang a whole constellation of noble houses, a vast and a spreading family tree whose branches reach into the very heart of the English aristocracy. Few women in all of history have founded so much, or seen their blood carried to such heights. When we stand back and survey the entirety of it, the dynasties founded, the houses raised, the fortune gathered, we begin to grasp the sheer scale of what this one woman achieved, and the more so when we remember from how little she began. There is hardly a parallel to it in the whole history of her age, this complete and this self-made ascent across the entire span of the social order, accomplished by a woman in a world that gave women so little scope for the exercise of their powers. She had no army, no office of state, no inherited greatness to build upon. She had only her wits, her will, her charm, her head for business, and her unrelenting determination, and with these alone she climbed from nothing to the very heights. The achievement is staggering when one truly weighs it, and it grows more staggering the more one considers the obstacles that stood in the way of any woman who sought to rise. For she did all of this in an age that held women to be the inferior and the dependent sex, and she did it not by abandoning her womanhood, but by turning the very tools and the very arts of a woman's life into the instruments of an extraordinary power. This brings us to one of the deepest and most interesting questions that the life of Bess raises, the question of what her achievement meant in the context of her age, and how a woman came to accomplish so much in a world so thoroughly ordered for the benefit of men. For the England of Bess's day was a society in which women were, by law and by custom alike, the subordinate sex, denied a place in government and the professions, expected to pass from the authority of a father to the authority of a husband, and very largely barred from the open exercise of power. A woman's sphere was the domestic establishment, her chief duty obedience, her natural condition dependence. And yet within this confining order there were spaces, narrow but real, in which a woman of exceptional gifts might exercise a genuine power, and she found and filled those spaces with a mastery that has rarely been equalled. The widow in particular stood freer than other women, mistress of her own property and her own person, and the Countess, widowed 4 times and each time the richer for it, made of her widowhoods the platform for an independent greatness. The management of an immense household and estate was a recognized sphere of female competence, and the Countess enlarged that domestic competence into the command of a vast commercial and landed empire. She worked, in other words, within the grain of her age, not against it, taking the very roles that her society allotted to women, the wife, the widow, the establishment manager, the mother, and pushing each of them to a scale and a pitch that amounted, in the end, to a power as considerable as that of all but a handful of men. In this she stood, in a sense, as a kind of subject and a mirror to the great queen who dominated her age, for Elizabeth too was a woman wielding a power that her society reserved in theory for men, and the two of them, the Queen and the Countess, were among the most formidable women that England has ever produced. There is a real likeness between them, beneath the vast difference of their stations, the same shrewdness, the same iron will, the same gift for survival in a dangerous world, the same capacity to turn the supposed weaknesses of their sex into instruments of strength, and she, in her own narrower sphere, achieved something of the same triumph of female power in a man's world that Elizabeth achieved upon the throne. She was not a queen, and she sought no crown for herself, but she was, in the kingdom of her own estates and her own family, a sovereign of sorts, ruling her lands and her household and her dynasty with an authority that brooked no rival. And she demonstrated, for all the ages to see, what a woman of sufficient gifts and sufficient determination could accomplish, even within the narrow bounds that her age allowed her, how far the spaces of widowhood and household and motherhood could be stretched by a will strong enough and a mind sharp enough to stretch them. The life of the Countess is, amid everything else that it is, one of the great stories of female achievement in an age that gave women almost nothing, and that is no small part of why it still compels us, 4 centuries on. Of all the monuments that Bess of Hardwick left behind her, the dynasties and the fortune and the carved tomb at Derby, the greatest and the most eloquent are surely the houses themselves, the buildings she raised across her life, for in them her character and her ambition are written more plainly than in anything else she did. She was, as we have seen again and again, a builder before all else, a woman who expressed herself in stone and glass on the grandest possible scale, and the houses she made are her truest portrait and her most enduring legacy. Chief among them stands Hardwick Hall, the shining house of glass upon the hill, which survives to this day in a state of remarkable preservation, very nearly as Bess left it more than 400 years ago, so that the visitor who climbs to it now may walk through the very rooms she walked, beneath the painted friezes she commissioned and along the imposing gallery she paced, and feel across the centuries the presence of the formidable woman who raised it. There are few houses anywhere in England that bring us so close to their builder, or that speak so clearly of a single overmastering personality. To stand within Hardwick Hall is to stand inside the mind and the will of Bess of Hardwick, made visible in plaster and tapestry and glass. And Hardwick was only the crown of an entire career of building, for she raised or transformed a number of fine mansions across her long life, beginning with the first Chatsworth, that earlier seat in the Derbyshire valley which she and Cavendish founded, and which, though later rebuilt by her descendants into the famous palace that stands there now, owed its origin and its first greatness to her. She rebuilt the old hall at Hardwick before she raised the new. Her sons, inheriting her passion as well as her fortune, went on to build noble seats of their own, so that the love of raising ran on in her blood for generations. In the history of English architecture, Bess holds an honoured and a peculiar place, as one of the patrons of the Elizabethan age, the builder of one of the supreme examples of that bold and original style of great mansion that flourished in the later years of the old Queen, the so-called prodigy houses, those astonishing and ambitious creations by which the wealthy of that age proclaimed their greatness. With the genius of Robert Smithson, she helped to bring into being a new kind of English house, tall and compact and glittering with glass, vertical where earlier ones had sprawled, designed for display and for grandeur. And Hardwick Hall remains the most perfect and the most famous survivor of that remarkable moment in the history of construction. It is worth reflecting on what it meant for a woman to be a grand builder in that age, for architecture and the raising of stately dwellings were, like so much else, very largely the province of men, and the patrons who commissioned the famous buildings of the age were almost all of them noblemen and gentlemen. That a woman should have been among the foremost builders of her age, the moving spirit behind one of its greatest works, is itself a mark of how far the Countess had broken through the constraints that bound her sex. She did not merely dwell in the buildings that men provided. She conceived and commissioned and drove forward the raising of great mansions of her own, imposing her vision and her will upon the work as decisively as any lord. The work of Hardwick was her project from first to last, the expression of her own taste and her own ambition, financed by her own fortune and stamped with her own initials. It was, in the most literal sense, her creation, and it stands as a monument not only to her wealth, but to her artistic vision and her commanding will. In an age that allowed women so little public scope, she found in building a vast and a lasting outlet for her energies, a way of writing her ambition permanently into the landscape of England, and the houses she raised are her enduring answer to the question of what a woman might achieve. But to understand the Countess fully, we must look not only at the grand halls she built, but at the existence that was lived within them, the daily round of a mighty Elizabethan household at the height of its splendour, for the Countess was not only a raiser of buildings but a ruler of households, the mistress of a vast domestic establishment that she governed with the same close attention she gave to all her affairs. A grand hall like Hardwick was a small world in itself, sheltering not only the family but a considerable population of servants and dependents, the women who attended the Countess and worked at the endless needlework, the men who managed the estate and the stables and the cellars, the cooks and the grooms and the maids and the labourers who kept the great machine of the household turning. Over all of this the Countess presided as an absolute sovereign, ordering the life of the house to her own exacting standards, keeping a close and a watchful eye on every department of it, ruling her servants firmly and sometimes harshly, missing nothing, allowing nothing to escape her control. She kept detailed account of everything, the food and the fuel and the wages and the stores, governing her domestic establishment with the precise and unflagging management of a woman, to whom the keeping of order and the watching of expense were second nature. The fine mansion ran upon her will, and bore her stamp in its every ordered detail. And a noble seat was a place of display and of hospitality, as well as of management, for the entertaining of guests, the receiving of visitors of rank, the keeping of a fine and an open table, were among the chief duties and the chief pleasures of a noble magnate, and she kept state at Hardwick in a manner befitting her wealth and her standing. The grand rooms of the seat, the high great chamber and the long gallery, and the rest, were settings for the reception of important guests, where the Countess could display her magnificence and assert her standing among the great, and the existence of the place had its ceremonies and its splendours, its feasts and its festivals, its comings and goings of visitors and family. There was a real grandeur to the existence she kept up in her final years, the state of a noblewoman in her own palace, surrounded by her treasures and her servants, dispensing hospitality and exercising the authority of a magnate. She had reached a position from which she could entertain the highest in the land, and she did so with the confidence of one who had earned her place by her own efforts. The girl who had once been a humble waiting gentlewoman in the household of her betters now ruled an establishment of her own as grand as any in the realm, the mistress where she had once been the servant, keeping her own state in her own glittering house. Among the most precious and most characteristic treasures of that household were the embroideries and the needlework with which the Countess surrounded herself, for the working of fine textiles was the great art and the considerable passion of her domestic life, pursued across the whole span of her years, and it forms a distinct and a beautiful part of her legacy. We have seen her at her needle in the company of the captive Queen of Scots, but the embroidery she made was no mere episode of those captive years. It was the lifelong work of herself and her household, a vast and a continuing production of fine worked textiles that adorned her houses and expressed her taste and her identity. The hangings and the cushions and the panels that came from her own workrooms, some worked by her own hand and many by the skilled women of her establishment under her direction, were rich and elaborate and full of meaning, dense with flowers and beasts and emblems and devices, many of them carrying her own initials and her own symbols woven into the design. A number of these remarkable textiles survive to this day among the finest examples of Elizabethan needlework that have come down to us, and they give us a vivid and an intimate sense of the artistic life of Bess's household, the patient skilled labour of the needle that went on, year after year, in the lofty chambers of her houses. These embroideries are worth dwelling on, for they show us a side of Bess that the tale of her marriages and her money and her building might otherwise obscure, the side of the artist and the woman of taste, the patron and practitioner of a real and a demanding craft. For the fine needlework of that age was no idle pastime but a serious art requiring skill and patience and a fine sense of colour and design, and the textiles that adorned a stately dwelling were among its most prized and most expensive treasures, as costly and as valued as paintings or plate. In her embroideries, as in her buildings, Bess expressed her ambition and her identity, working her initials and her emblems into the fabric of her houses, as she carved them into the stone of her towers. The whole of Hardwick, within and without, was stamped with the mark of its maker in glass and stone and woven thread alike. There is something deeply revealing in this, in the way that Bess turned even the domestic art of the needle into another instrument of self-assertion and display, another means of declaring across the centuries who she was and what she had made of herself. The embroideries of Hardwick are, in their way, as much a portrait of Bess as the hall that holds them, the patient handiwork of an ambitious woman stitched into permanence. We should not forget, in dwelling on the splendour and the achievement of Bess's life, the dangerous and the turbulent age through which she made her way, for the England of the Tudors was a perilous place to live, above all for those who moved near the centre of power, and she survived and prospered through decades of upheaval that destroyed many a greater figure. She was born into the reign of Henry VIII, that age of broken faith and confiscated wealth and the sudden fall of the mighty, when a queen might go to the block and an imposing minister be destroyed in an afternoon. She lived through the brief reign of the boy king and the religious convulsions that followed, through the Catholic Restoration under Mary and the long Protestant settlement under Elizabeth, through plots and rebellions and the constant menace of war and conspiracy. To survive and to rise through such an age required not only ability, but a fine and a constant prudence, a sure instinct for where safety lay, and a careful avoidance of the fatal misstep. And she, for all her boldness in the gathering of wealth, was prudent in the things that mattered most for survival, keeping clear of the religious extremes and the political conspiracies that ruined so many of her contemporaries. She was a firm Protestant, loyal to the crown and to the established order, and she kept her family, for the most part, on the safe side of the divides of the age. Her closeness to the affair of the Queen of Scots shows just how near the fire she sometimes came, for in the keeping of that royal prisoner, she and her husband stood at the very centre of the most dangerous business in the kingdom, surrounded by plots and suspicions, exposed to the deadly possibility that some conspiracy might succeed or some breath of disloyalty attach itself to them. The captive queen was a magnet for treason, and those who guarded her walked always in danger, and the eventual fate of Mary, who was in the end brought to trial and to execution for her part in the plots against Elizabeth, was a grim reminder of how lethal the politics of that age could be. Through all of this, Bess kept her footing, neither drawn into the conspiracies that swirled about her royal charge nor destroyed by the suspicions that such a position inevitably bred. She navigated the deadly currents of the succession and the religious struggle with the same shrewd care that she brought to her finances, and she came through, where so many foundered, with her fortune and her family and her head all intact. It was no small achievement, this survival through so dangerous an age, and it speaks of a prudence and a political sense as remarkable in their way as her gifts for business and for raising. The Countess prospered not in a safe and a settled world, but in a treacherous and a violent one, and her survival was itself a kind of triumph. At the very centre of that perilous world stood the Queen herself, and the Countess's long relationship with Elizabeth was one of the most delicate and most consequential threads of her entire career, a wary dance between two of the most formidable women of the age. The Countess had risen into the highest favour in the early years of the reign through her marriage to the captain of the Queen's Guard, and she moved thereafter in the orbit of the court, known to the Queen and reckoned among her great subjects. But the favour of so suspicious and so changeable a sovereign was never a thing to be relied upon, and the Countess had to tend her standing with the crown as carefully as she tended her estates. The keeping of the Queen of Scots set her at the very heart of Elizabeth's gravest concerns. The vast quarrel with the Earl of Shrewsbury drew the Queen in as a mediator between her warring subjects, and above all the matter of the granddaughter Arbella, with her dangerous claim to the succession, kept Bess for ever under the watchful and the jealous eye of a queen who could brook no rival near her throne. Through all of it Bess trod with care, now basking in favour and now falling under suspicion, managing her relations with the crown across the decades with the same shrewd attention she brought to all her affairs. The two mighty women, the Queen upon her throne and the Countess in her tower, were alike in their strength and their will and their gift for survival, and Bess, the lesser of the two in station, kept her footing beside the greater, through all the dangers of a long reign, neither raised too high by favour nor cast down by the Queen's mistrust, but holding steadily to her place at the summit of the realm. Behind the legend of Bess, the 4 marriages and the fine mansions and the towering fortune, there stands a real and a complicated woman, and it is worth trying, before we come to the close of our story, to see past the bare facts of her rise to the human character that drove it. She was, by every account that has come down to us, a person of formidable force, charming and capable and immensely strong-willed, the kind of personality that dominates every room it enters and bends events to its purpose. But she was no simple figure, and her character held its contradictions and its shadows as every real character does. There was warmth in her. Certainly the warmth that won her 4 devoted husbands and held the loyalty of servants and friends, a real capacity for affection that shows in her closeness to the husband she loved and in the fierce devotion she gave to the advancement of her children. And there was hardness too, an unrelenting drive, and a streak of ruthlessness in the pursuit of her ends, a willingness to fight without mercy for money and property, to quarrel bitterly with husband and child alike when her interests were crossed, to use whatever weapon came to hand, even the cruel weapon of slander, in her wars over wealth. She was warm and she was hard, generous and grasping, loving and ruthless, all at once. She was, in short, a fine and a complex human being, not a saint and not a monster, but a powerful and a driven woman of flesh and blood. The contradictions of her nature show most sharply in her family life, for there the warmth and the hardness met and clashed, and the same fierce maternal love that raised up her children could turn, when they disappointed or defied her, into a cold and an unforgiving severity. She loved her children, and laboured all her career for their advancement, and yet she quarrelled bitterly with more than one of them, disinherited her own eldest son, and ruled her granddaughter with a control so tight that it drove the unhappy girl toward desperation. She could be a warm and a generous friend and a devoted wife, and yet she could pursue a husband through the courts with implacable ferocity and blacken his name with a deadly rumour. There is no resolving these contradictions into a simple verdict, for they were all of them truly present in her, the love and the severity, the generosity and the grasping, woven together in a single strong and difficult character. She was a woman who loved fiercely and fought fiercely, who gave her heart and guarded her interests with equal intensity, and the very strength of will that carried her to greatness made her at times a hard and an exacting wife and mother and grandmother. Greatness of her kind is rarely gentle. The force that builds dynasties is not always kind to those caught up in its working, and there was, beneath the splendour of her success, a real human cost to her climb, a price paid in broken relationships and in loneliness that we should not pass over in our admiration of her triumph. Her greatest marriage ended in bitter estrangement, the 2 of them living apart in mutual hostility through the last years of the Earl's life, their union poisoned by the very acquisitiveness that had carried them both so high. Her eldest son was a grief and a disappointment to her, cast off at the last from his inheritance. Her beloved granddaughter chafed and rebelled against her control, and would come, after Bess's own death, to a tragic end. The very qualities that made Bess great, the relentless drive, the controlling will, the unsleeping concern for property and advantage, were qualities that strained and sometimes broke the bonds of affection around her, and there is a loneliness, one feels, at the heart of her later greatness, the isolation of a powerful old woman who had outlived her husbands, quarrelled with her children, and trusted, in the end, chiefly in her houses and her fortune and her own indomitable self. She had won everything she set out to win, but the winning had its price, and she paid it in the coin of human warmth, in estrangements and solitude and the hard loneliness of a will that could never quite rest. It is fair to ask, looking at the complete shape of her days, whether the Countess was happy, whether all the climbing and the building and the gathering brought her, in the end, contentment. And the honest answer is that we cannot know, and that perhaps the question itself is somewhat beside the point for a person of her particular caste. For Bess does not seem to have been a woman who pursued happiness, exactly in the way that gentler souls pursue it. She pursued security and greatness and permanence, the founding of families and the raising of monuments, and the gathering of wealth against the terror of want. And in these things she succeeded magnificently. Whether that success brought her joy, whether she knew moments of simple contentment amid her ceaseless striving, the records do not tell us. She was not given, so far as we can see, to introspection or to rest. What we can say is that she achieved, with a completeness given to very few, the deepest purposes of her own nature, that she made the security and the greatness she had craved since her anxious childhood, and that she died in the midst of her triumph, mistress of all she had made. If that is happiness, then she was happy. If happiness is something gentler and warmer, then perhaps it eluded her, as it eludes so many of the noble and the driven. But she was, beyond all question, fulfilled in the things she most desired, and for a woman of her fierce ambition, that may have been enough. Something of the real Bess, the living voice beneath the legend, comes down to us in her own words, for she was a vigorous and a frequent writer of letters, and a number of her letters survive to give us a vivid sense of the woman as she was. They are the letters of a practical, forceful, sharp-minded person, full of the business of estates and money and family, written in a plain and a direct and a vigorous style, without affectation or ornament, the letters of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and was used to getting it. Through them we catch the accent of her personality, the briskness, the shrewdness, the unflagging attention to her own interests, the strong affections and the strong resentments. We see her managing her affairs, advancing her line, contending with her enemies, ruling her realm by the power of her pen as well as her presence. There is no mistaking the force of character that breathes through these documents the sense of a powerful and a capable and an utterly determined human being going about the business of her days, and they bring us across 4 centuries into something like direct contact with the woman herself, the real Bess behind the marble effigy and the towering legend. To read her letters is to hear, faintly but unmistakably, the living voice of the child from Hardwick who made herself a lady. History has remembered the Countess in many ways, not all of them just, and it is worth pausing on the legend that has grown up around her, the better to see the real woman clearly. The popular memory has tended to reduce her to a few striking features, the 4 husbands above all, so that she is remembered too often as a kind of monster of matrimonial ambition, a scheming widow who wedded and outlived one rich husband after another in a cold, calculated climb to wealth. There is a grain of truth in the caricature, for she did indeed marry 4 times and rise by each marriage, and she was indeed a woman of relentless acquisitive drive, but the caricature does her a deep injustice, for it reduces an immense and a complex achievement to a sordid little tale of gold-digging, and it ignores almost everything that made her remarkable. The real Bess was not merely a marrier of rich men, but a builder, a manager, an artist, a dynast, a woman who created noble seats and founded considerable families and exercised, through her own gifts, a power and an influence rare for anyone of her sex in that age. To remember her only for her husbands is to miss the woman entirely, to see the marriages and not the immense and varied life that was created around and beyond them. She deserves better of history than the legend of the scheming widow. She deserves to be remembered as one of the most remarkable self-made figures of her whole remarkable age. For when we set her marriages in their true place, as the means and not the substance of her greatness, the real stature of Bess of Hardwick comes clear, and it is the stature of a builder and a maker on the grandest scale. The marriages were the ladder, but the climbing was her own, and what she built at the top of the ladder, the houses, the dynasties, the fortune, The entire lofty structure of her dynasty's enduring greatness was the work of her own vision and her own will. Other women married rich men and outlived them and gained their wealth and are forgotten. What sets Bess apart is what she did with the wealth once she had it, the energy and the imagination and the relentless drive with which she turned each fortune into the foundation of a greater one, and the whole into a monument that has outlasted the centuries. She was a creator, in the end, not merely an acquirer. She made things that endured, houses that still stand, families that still flourish, a legacy written across the landscape and the aristocracy of England in characters that 400 years have not erased. That is the true measure of her, and it dwarfs the petty legend of the husband-hunting widow, as Hardwick Hall dwarfs the cottages in its valley. Bess of Hardwick was a great builder of the permanent and the enduring, and that, far more than her marriages, is why we remember her still. To understand how such a rise as Bess's was possible at all, we must set her against the background of her century, for she was the child and the beneficiary of one of the most turbulent and most fluid ages in the entire history of England, a time when the old order was breaking up and new families were rising as never before. The reign of Henry VIII had shattered the settled world of the late Middle Ages, above all through the dissolution of the monasteries, when the immense wealth and the vast lands of the religious houses were seized by the crown and scattered, sold and granted, among the king's servants and favourites, and the rising men of the age. This colossal transfer of property, the greatest redistribution of land in English history, threw open the doors of advancement to a whole new class of ambitious and capable people, and made fortunes for families who had been nobody a generation before. It was an age of opportunity such as England had rarely seen, when a clever and a determined person, well placed and well connected, might rise with astonishing speed to wealth and standing. The husband who first made Bess rich, William Cavendish, was himself one of these rising men enriched by the spoils of the monasteries, and she herself was the supreme example of the new mobility, a person of obscure birth carried to the summit by ability and ambition in an age that for once rewarded them. It was in this sense exactly the right age for a woman like Bess to have been born into, an age of flux and opportunity, and the rapid making and unmaking of fortunes, when the rigid barriers of an older world had been loosened and a path lay open for those bold enough to take it from obscurity to greatness. Had she been born a century earlier, into the more settled and more closed society of the late Middle Ages, it is hard to imagine that even her gifts could have carried her so far. The channels of advancement would have been narrower, the barriers of birth more absolute, the imposing redistribution of wealth that fueled her rise simply not available. But she was born into the Tudor century, the age of the new men and the rising families, and she rode its currents with consummate skill, seizing the opportunities it offered with both hands and climbing on the rising tide of a transformed society. She was a creature of her age as well as a wonder of it, the product of a particular moment when England was unusually open to the ambitious and the able, and her astonishing career is, among other things, a vivid illustration of the social revolution that the Tudor upheavals had set in motion, the rise of a new aristocracy of wealth and service alongside and amid the old aristocracy of blood. Amid the grand affairs of work and dynasty and survival, there were quieter and more curious episodes in the life of the Countess, and one of the most interesting is her connection with the waters of Buxton, that ancient spa among the hills, which she and her husband the Earl helped to make fashionable in their day. For at Buxton, not far from the stately dwellings of the Shrewsburys, there rose warm springs out of the ground, waters that had been known since the time of the Romans for their healing virtues, and in the age of Bess these waters came into a new fashion as a resort for the ailing and the genteel. The Earl of Shrewsbury developed the seat raising a fine lodging-house there to receive the visitors who came to take the waters for their health, and Buxton became a fashionable spa, drawing the gentry and the nobility to bathe in and to drink the warm mineral springs in the hope of relief from their ailments. It was an age much troubled by the diseases that the medicine of the day could do little to cure, and the springs of Buxton offered a gentler and a more hopeful kind of treatment, a pleasant resort where one might combine the seeking of health with the pleasures of agreeable company in a beautiful setting amid the hills. Even the captive Queen of Scots was permitted, in the years of her keeping by the Shrewsburys, to travel under guard to Buxton for the sake of her health, drinking and bathing for the ailments that afflicted her in her long confinement. And so those springs among the hills became woven, like so much else in Bess's world, into the strange drama of the royal captivity. There is a pleasant human interest in this, for it shows her and her husband, amid all their weighty concerns, engaged in the homely and the beneficial business of developing a resort for the sick, and it reminds us how near, even to the greatest, lay the constant dread of illness in an age when the body was so much at the mercy of disease. The warm springs still rise from the ground to this day, as they did in the time of the Romans and in the time of Bess, a small constant thread running through the centuries. And the place that the Shrewsburys helped to raise is one more of the lesser monuments of their age, a quieter memorial than Hardwick Hall, but a real one, where the sick and the hopeful came to seek their ease among the Derbyshire slopes. We have spoken much of Bess herself, but a lordly hall was never only its mistress, and it is worth turning our thoughts for a while to the company of people who lived and laboured within her walls, the wide community that surrounded her and made her grand way of living possible. A seat like Hardwick or Chatsworth sheltered a whole little society in itself, scores of souls whose lives were bound up with the place and its mistress, a populous world of officers and gentlewomen, and labouring hands ranged in careful order from the high tables down to the kitchen and the field. They were the human fabric of the place, the living society whose effort kept it breathing, and whose voices filled its corridors and its courtyards, and their days, passed in the shadow and the service of the great, were as much a part of what such a seat truly was as the glass and the tapestries by which we remember it. To stand in imagination within those bright rooms is to people them again, not with the Countess alone, but with the whole thronging multitude of her dependents, the quiet population whose unremarked toil was the ground on which all her magnificence was raised. Bess governed this community with a firm and a watchful authority, ruling her servants strictly and keeping them to their duties, but the relation between a mistress and her servants was not only one of command, for there grew up in such places real bonds of loyalty and dependence and even affection across the gulf of rank. The servants of a grand hall often gave a lifetime of service to a single family, becoming the trusted and the familiar supports of the establishment, known to the family and bound to it by long association. And the better sort of grand establishment bred a real attachment between the family and those who served it across the years. The Countess, for all her hardness in matters of business, seems to have commanded the loyalty of those who served her, holding it together by the force of her personality and the steadiness of her rule and the community of her houses. The entire human establishment of servants and dependents that surrounded her was as much a part of her sphere as the glass and the stone and the tapestries. When we picture Bess in her great mansions, we should picture her not alone, but at the head of this living community, the mistress of a populous household, surrounded by the scores of people whose lives turned about her own. And what of the houses themselves, the considerable buildings that were the crown of all her labour in the long centuries after the Countess herself was gone? Here the story takes a turn that would surely have pleased her, for the houses endured, and endure still, carrying her name and her memory down through age after age, long after every other trace of her had faded. Hardwick Hall, above all, survived in a state of extraordinary preservation, passing down through her Cavendish descendants and remaining, through all the changing fashions of the centuries, very nearly as Bess had left it, a lofty Elizabethan house preserved almost untouched into the modern world. The accidents of inheritance and of family fortune spared it, the rebuildings and the modernizations that swept away or transformed so many of its contemporaries, so that it came down through the generations as a kind of perfect survival, the most complete and the most evocative of all Elizabethan houses, the residence of Bess preserved as a window into her vanished age. To this day it stands upon its hill, crowned with her initials, filled with her tapestries and her embroideries, the proud glass house of the girl from the small manor, kept and cherished as one of the treasures of the nation. There is a deep and a moving justice in this survival, for it means that she achieved, in the most literal way, the permanence she so craved, the lasting monument that would carry her memory beyond her own brief life into the reach of the centuries. She had built against mortality and obscurity, raising her grand halls and carving her initials in stone precisely so that she should not be forgotten, so that the child who had risen from nothing should leave behind her something that would endure. And the gamble succeeded beyond all reasonable hope, for 400 years and more have passed, and her hall still stands, her name still sounds, her memory is still green. Few people in any age achieve such permanence, the survival of their name and their work across so vast a span of time, and the Countess achieved it by the very means she had chosen, by building solid and lasting things and stamping them indelibly with her own identity. The houses outlived her, as she meant them to, and they carry her still down the river of time, the glass tower on the hill bearing the initials of Elizabeth Shrewsbury up against the sky for the people of each new age to see and to wonder at. She wanted to be remembered, and remembered against all the odds of time she has triumphantly been. Let us pause now, as our story draws toward its close, and simply hold in the mind the whole imposing arc of this life, from its beginning to its end, for there is something in the sheer span of it that rewards a quiet contemplation. Begin where she began, with a small girl in a draughty manor amid the Derbyshire uplands, a younger daughter of a fallen gentry family, fatherless and pinched and obscure, with no fortune of her own and no prospect before her, but a modest local marriage and a life lived out within sight of the hills she was born among. Hold that picture for a moment, the plain little manor, the anxious household, the unconsidered child with nothing in the world but her wits and her will, and then follow her across the long years, through the 4 marriages, the gathering of the fortune, the building of the houses, the founding of the families, all the way to the other end of her existence, and hold that picture too, the old Countess in her shining tower of glass, the richest woman in England after the Queen, the grandmother of earls, the builder of a wonder, her own initials carved against the sky above her. Set the 2 pictures side by side, the small girl in the manor and the old Countess in the tower, and feel the immense distance between them, the entire vast height of the climb. For that distance, travelled in a single lifetime by one determined woman, is the true measure of what Bess of Hardwick achieved. It is a distance that staggers the imagination when one truly dwells on it, for there were few longer journeys that anyone could make in that age than the one Bess made, from the bottom of the gentry to the summit of the nobility, from obscurity to fame, from pinched anxiety to immense wealth. People did rise in the Tudor century, as we have seen, but few rose so far, and fewer still were women, for whom the paths of advancement were so much narrower. The journey Bess made was very nearly the longest that her realm permitted, the whole vertical sweep of the social order, traversed by a single person in a single life. And she made it not by luck or by accident, but by the steady exercise of her own remarkable gifts across decade after decade, by ability and ambition and an unrelenting will, climbing always, gathering always, raising always, never resting, never sliding back, turning every chance to account and every fortune into the foundation of a greater. The girl who began with nothing ended with nearly everything that her world could offer, and the climb between the two was the work of her own hands, and her own head, and her own indomitable heart. It is one of the great rags-to-riches stories of all history, and it loses none of its power for being 4 centuries old. The small girl became the great lady, and she did it herself. And yet, for all the splendour of the achievement, there is a deeper note that sounds beneath it as we contemplate the entirety of her existence, the note that sounds beneath all human striving when we look at it from a long way off, the note of time and of mortality, and of the brief span of even the grandest life. For Bess, who built so mightily against forgetting, who raised her houses and carved her initials precisely to defeat the oblivion that swallows us all, was herself in the end only mortal, and her long life, full as it was, came to its close like every other. The mighty Countess died as the small girl had been born, and the tower of glass outlived its builder. There is something both triumphant and poignant in this, in the spectacle of a human being striving so hard to win a permanence of her own, to build something that would outlast her, knowing, as we all know in our depths, that we ourselves cannot last. Bess raised against the dark, against the great darkness of time and death, and forgetting that waits for all of us. And in a sense she won, for her houses still stand, and her name still sounds, longer than she could ever have hoped. But the woman herself is gone these 400 years, and the tower she made keeps its vigil over an empty hill, the monument outliving the maker, as monuments always do. There is a lesson in that, perhaps, or not a lesson exactly, but a truth, a thing to feel rather than to learn, about the way that human beings pour their lives into the making of things that will outlast them, the houses and the works, and the children that carry our memory forward when we ourselves are gone. We are all of us, in our smaller ways, doing a little of what Bess did, building against the dark, trying to make something that will last, to leave a mark upon the world that will not be wholly washed away once we have left it. It is one of the deepest of human impulses, this reaching for a permanence we cannot ourselves possess. She felt that impulse with extraordinary force, and she had the wealth and the will to act upon it as few can, raising her monuments of stone and glass and blood, and so her story shows us, written very large, a truth that holds for all our lives, the longing to endure, to be remembered, to leave behind us a solid thing in the flowing river of time. There is a tenderness in it, and a sadness too, and a quality deeply and recognizably human, and it draws her close to us, across all the distance of the centuries, this woman who wanted, as we all want, not to be forgotten. And so, when we ask at the last what it was truly like to be Bess, to live that long and that driven and that triumphant life, we find that we cannot fully answer, for the inner life of so distant a person is hidden from us, and the records tell us what she did far more than what she felt. We can imagine the satisfactions of it, the deep contentment of an ambition fulfilled, the pleasure of work and gathering and founding, the pride of standing at the summit she had climbed to by her own efforts. And we can imagine the costs of it too, the loneliness of the controlling will, the broken bonds, the restlessness that could never quite be stilled. But the heart of her, the felt texture of her days, remains her own, carried with her into the silence 400 years ago. We have her houses, and her letters, and her deeds, but the living woman is gone beyond our reach. What we are left with is the immense shape of the days, the astonishing arc of the rise, the monuments that endure, and these are enough to mark her out as one of the most remarkable people her age produced, a figure of extraordinary force and achievement, the girl from the small manor who made herself a great lady and left her mark upon her country for all the centuries to come. Perhaps that is the truest way to remember her, not as a saint or a monster, or a mere marrier of rich men, but as a builder in the largest sense, a maker of enduring things, a woman who took the obscure and unpromising materials of her own beginning and created from them, by sheer force of will and gift, a life and a legacy of astonishing grandeur. She erected houses, and they stand yet. She built families, and they flourish yet. She built a fortune, and a name, and a memory, and all of them have outlasted the centuries. And she raised in the end herself, making out of a pinched and a fatherless gentry girl one of the leading figures of the English Renaissance, a self-made magnate the like of whom her age had rarely seen, and her sex had hardly ever produced. The achievement is hers entirely, the climb and the proud building and the lasting legacy, the work of one determined woman across the span of one extraordinary life, and it stands, like her house of glass upon the hill, as a monument to what the human will, given gifts enough, and time enough, and chances enough, can raise out of the most unpromising of beginnings. Bess of Hardwick made her life as she built her houses, with vision and with toil, and with an unconquerable will, and the building still stands. Let us go inside the fine mansion one more time, before we leave it, and pass a single ordinary day there in the imagination, for there is a quiet pleasure in picturing the daily round of living within those glittering walls, the small, unremarkable hours that made up the existence of the domestic establishment. The day at Hardwick began early, as days did in that age, with the first grey light coming in through the enormous windows that gave the dwelling its fame, filling the tall chambers with a pale, clear glow long before the sun was properly up. For a residence of so much glass was a seat full of light, flooded with the changing weather of the sky in a way that older and darker houses never were. The servants stirred first, raking the fires and carrying the water, and setting the machine of the domestic establishment in motion, the maids about the chambers, the men at the stables and the yards, the cooks already at their work in the kitchens far below. And gradually the place came awake, the long galleries and the wide stairs filling with the soft business of an imposing establishment beginning its day. And somewhere in the upper chambers the old countess herself rose and was dressed and made ready, the mistress of it all, to take up once more the management of her wide affairs. The morning was given over to business, for the countess was a woman of business to the last, and the early hours found her at her accounts and her letters, attending to the endless detail of her estates and her household, her builders and her tenants and her money. She would receive those who came to her on the affairs of the estate, give her orders for the day, look into the keeping of her stores and her expenses, dictate or pen the letters by which she governed her far-flung concerns. The web of her wealth and her family ran through her hands every morning, and she held every thread of it with a close attention. And then there was the hall itself to be overseen, the raising and the furnishing and the adorning that never quite ceased while she lived, for there was always some work in hand, some chamber to be hung with fresh tapestry, some new piece of needlework to be set going, some detail of the grand glittering machine of her magnificence to be attended to. The morning at Hardwick was the countess at her work, the formidable old woman governing her world from her tower of glass, as sharp and as exacting in her 8th decade as she had been in her prime. The middle of the day brought the chief meal, taken with the ceremony that befitted a noble seat, and then the afternoon, which might be given to the gentler occupations of a noble household, to needlework above all, that lifelong labour of the countess and her women, the threads drawn patiently through the cloth in the bright light of the vast windows. There might be walking in the long gallery, that vast bright room made for just such exercise, the Countess pacing its length amid her tapestries and her portraits with the slow steps of age. There might be the receiving of visitors, the small society of a stately dwelling, the talk of family and estate, and the affairs of the county. And so the day wore on toward evening, the light slowly changing in the tall windows as the sun went round, the shadows gathering in the mighty chambers, until at last the candles were lit, and the fires built up against the chill of the Derbyshire night, and the mansion settled into the warm, flickering intimacy of its evening hours. The grandeur of glass gave way, when darkness fell, to the close gold light of candle and hearth, and the fine rooms drew in about their points of warmth, and the establishment gathered toward its rest. In the evening, the old house was at its most beautiful, and its most intimate, the firelight playing on the rich hangings and the carved wood, the candles throwing their soft moving glow up the tall walls, the noble cold spaces of glass gone dark and the warm chambers drawn close about the fires. The Countess in her last years would sit in such a chamber as the night came on, an old woman among her treasures, the long day's business done, the household quiet, the firelight on her face, and one likes to think of her there, in the warm heart of the lordly hall she had raised, taking what ease the evening brought after the long effort of her days. Outside, the wind would be moving over the hills as it had moved over the small manor of her birth so very long before. The same wind, the same hills, the same dark country, but she was sheltered now, deep in the warmth of her own great mansion, the girl from the manor grown old in the tower she had built. And so the day at Hardwick came to its close, the candles guttering, the fires sinking, the glass house standing tall and silent upon its hill beneath the wheeling stars, while within it the household slept, and the old Countess with them. Beyond the walls of the grand hall, stretching away over the slopes and valleys of Derbyshire and far past them, lay the broad lands that were the true foundation of all this magnificence, the estates whose produce and whose rents and whose hidden riches paid for the glass and the tapestries and the towers, and it is worth turning our eyes, for a while, from the splendour of the dwelling to the working country that sustained it. For the wealth of the Countess did not come from nowhere. It rose, in the end, out of the land, out of the patient labour of farms and flocks, out of the dark riches dug from beneath the Derbyshire uplands, out of the whole working world of the countryside that she ruled as its immense proprietor. Her broad acres were farmed by her tenants, who paid their rents and worked their holdings and sent the produce of the land up toward the fine mansion. Her pastures carried the flocks whose wool was among the considerable riches of England. Her fields turned green and gold with the seasons, growing the bread of her tables and the income of her coffers. The grandeur of Hardwick stood upon the broad back of the working land, upon the toil of the country people who tilled and tended and harvested across the wide estates of the Countess, and beneath the green surface of the land lay other riches still, for the hills were veined with valuable minerals, and Bess, ever alert to a source of profit, drew wealth from the workings beneath her ground as well as from the fields above it. The county was a great producer of lead, that heavy and useful metal dug from the mines that pierced the limestone country, and there was coal as well, and stone for construction, and the materials for the glass that made her residence so famous, and the mineral wealth of her lands flowed into the Countess's fortune alongside the rents and the produce of her farms. It was a hard and a dangerous work, the work of the mines, carried on in the dark and the wet by the men who delved for the lead and the coal beneath the hills. Far from the bright glass chambers of the hall, their toil helped to raise, and it reminds us that the magnificence of the great rested always upon the labour of the many, that the shining tower on the hill was paid for, in the end, by the sweat of farmers and miners and labouring folk whose names are wholly forgotten. The entire working land, The farms and the flocks and the mines and the quarries laboured to sustain the greatness of the Countess, and she, the proprietor, gathered the fruits of all that effort into her own hands. The seasons turned over this working country as they had always turned, in the unchanging round of the agricultural year, and the existence of the estate moved with them, governed by the ancient rhythms of seed-time and harvest, of lambing and shearing and slaughter, of the short dark days of winter and the long light days of summer. In the spring the land was ploughed and sown, and the flocks bore their young. In the summer the hay was cut, and the hours filled with the work of the growing season. In the autumn came the harvest, the heavy labour of bringing in the grain, and the gathering and the storing against the coming cold. And in the winter the region drew in upon itself the short days and the long nights, the land at rest beneath the frost, while the domestic establishment lived on the stores it had laid by. On the deepest of the winter nights the frost would feather the inside of those famous windows in patterns of its own, and the cold would press close against the panes, and far above the dark shoulder of the hill the winter stars would wheel in their slow procession across a sky scoured clean by the wind, while the fires were banked low in the chambers, and the sleepers lay warm beneath their weight of woolen coverlets. This unchanging round of the rural year was the deep, slow heartbeat beneath all the drama of Bess's life, the patient turning of the seasons over the Derbyshire slopes, the same in her old age as in her childhood, the same for the Countess in her tower, as for the humblest of her tenants in their cottages. The fields greened and ripened and were cut and lay fallow. The flocks were born and grew and were shorn. The year turned and turned again, and the existence of the grand estate moved always to that ancient measure. There is a kind of peace in dwelling on these slow rhythms of the land, after all the striving and the climbing and the vast drama of Bess's career, for the turning of the seasons over the country puts even the grandest human life into a gentle perspective. The Countess schemed and built and gathered, rose and triumphed and at last died, but the seasons turned on as they had always turned, the spring following the winter, the harvest following the seed time, the patient round of the working year carrying on across the same uplands, indifferent to the rise and fall of even the greatest of those who held them. There is comfort in that thought, and not sadness, the comfort of the enduring earth beneath the brief drama of human lives, the slow green countryside abiding, while the generations of the mighty come and go above it. The Countess held her broad lands for a while, and drew her wealth from them, and raised her shining house upon them, and then she passed, as all the holders of the land must pass, and the seasons turned on over the hills, and turn on still, the same spring and summer and autumn, and winter wheeling over the Derbyshire land 400 years after the great Countess closed her eyes for the last time in her tower of glass. In her noble old age, she was not only the mistress of houses and estates, but the matriarch of a wide and a growing house, the living head of a line that spread out below her in children and grandchildren, and there is a warmth in this final picture of her that softens a little the harder lines of the ambitious magnate. For all her quarrels and her severities, she was the centre and the source of a line, the old woman from whom a whole rising tribe of descendants took their origin, and in her last years she presided over this living dynasty as its founder and its head. Her grandchildren grew up about her, the children of her children, the next generation in whom her blood and her hopes ran on, and she watched over them, schemed for them, gathered them into the grand design of her dynasty's advancement, as she had watched and schemed for their parents before them. There is the granddaughter Arbella above all, raised under her own roof and her own jealous eye. But there were others too, a spreading company of Cavendishes and Talbots and the rest, the seed of the future, growing up in the shadow of the formidable old woman who had founded all their fortunes. In her old age, she was a great matriarch surrounded by her descendants, the living root of a family tree that would spread, in the centuries to come, across the entire high nobility of England. It is a very human picture, this, the old woman amid her grandchildren, and it reminds us that behind the great career there was, after all, a family life, with its affections and its frictions, its hopes and its disappointments, like the family life of any other house. She loved her own in her fierce, demanding way, and she bound it to her, and she laboured for it without ceasing. And though she could be hard with those who crossed or failed her, she could be warm and generous too with those who pleased her, lavishing her care and her wealth upon the children and the grandchildren in whom she saw the future of her line. The fine mansions she raised were made in the end for them, for the dynasty that would inherit and continue her greatness. The fortune she gathered was gathered to be passed on. The whole vast structure of her achievement was raised at bottom to found and to endow a line that would carry her name and her blood down the ages. And so, when we picture her at the last, we should picture her not only as the lone magnate in her tower, but as the matriarch at the heart of a proud house, the old founder surrounded by the generations she had brought into being, the source from which a mighty dynasty flowed. She had wanted, above all, to found a dynasty that would endure, and in her old age she could see that family taking shape around her, the living proof that her deepest ambition would be fulfilled. The fates of those grandchildren lay mostly beyond her own lifetime, in years she would not see, and some of them would be glorious and some would be tragic, as the fates of any family's children are. But the founding of them all was hers, the matriarch who had raised the houses and gathered the fortune that would shape their lives. From this wide-spreading family, nurtured by Bess in her old age, would come the dukes and the earls and the great figures of later generations, the long line of her descendants stretching away into a future she could only imagine. And she stood at the head of it all, the founder, the source, the old woman in the glass tower from whom so much would flow. There is a grandeur in that position, the grandeur of the founder who sees dimly the line that will spring from her toil, and she, surveying her grandchildren in her last years, could feel with justice that she had built not only houses of stone, but a kindred of blood, a dynasty, a line that would carry her forward into the centuries. The matriarch in her tower was the fountainhead of a mighty river of descent, and she knew it, and it was the crown of all her satisfactions. And now the story draws in toward its quiet end, and we come back, for the last time, to the old countess in her noble seat upon the hill, in the closing years of her long and her extraordinary life. Picture her there one last time, in the gathering dusk of a winter afternoon, an old woman seated by a high window of her tower of glass, looking out over the darkening country of her birth. She is very old now, near the end of her road, full of years and honours and wealth beyond anything the child from the small manor could ever have dreamed. And she sits quietly in the failing light, the stately dwelling hushed around her, the firelight beginning to glow in the chamber as the day dies outside. Below her and about her stretches the visible proof of a whole life's work, the broad lands, the splendid houses, the spreading family, the grand structure of greatness she has raised with her own will out of nothing, and within her perhaps move the memories of all the years, the small manor and the sickly boy husband, the happy years with Cavendish and the work of Chatsworth, the captive queen at her needlework, and the lordly hall rising on the hill, the entire vast journey from the bottom to the top of the realm. What does she feel, the old countess at her window in the dusk, as she looks back across that whole climb? We cannot know, and we should not pretend to, but we may imagine a kind of deep and weary satisfaction, the contentment of a vast task, wholly accomplished, mingled, perhaps, with the loneliness that gathers about the end of any driven life. She has won everything she set out to win, and outlived almost everyone she began with, and erected the lasting monuments she craved. She sits now at the summit of a life's achievement, with little left to do but to set her affairs in order and wait for the end. The fierce engine of her ambition that drove her so hard for so long may rest at last. The climbing is done, the building all but finished, the dynasty founded, the houses raised, and so she sits in the deepening dusk, the old woman in the glass tower, the firelight on her face, the dark country spreading away beneath her window, the wind moving over the hills of her birth as it moved when she was a child long ago. The day is ending, and the mighty life is ending, and the old countess waits quietly for the night. There is no need to hurry on from this quiet place, near the end of so loud and so striving a story. For a course of striving like hers, all motion and ambition, and the ceaseless reaching after more, comes to rest at the last in the same stillness that waits for the gentlest and the least striving of us. And there is a strange comfort in that, the great builder and the quiet soul arriving together, in the end at the same silence. We have travelled a long way together through the story of one remarkable woman, and the night is far advanced now, and there is no further place we need to reach. There is time only to be still a while, and to let the telling settle, before we gather up its last few threads. Before we let the night come fully down, let us try to see her once. The woman as her own age saw her. For we have spoken of all that she did, but hardly at all of how she looked and bore herself, the outward image of the great lady she became. Something of that image survives in the portraits that were painted of her across her days, and in them we may catch a glimpse of the formidable presence that dominated her world. There she stands in the manner of the grand ladies of her age, robed richly and soberly in the dark, and the costly fabrics that proclaimed both wealth and dignity, her gown heavy with the rich materials that only the lofty could afford, set off by the fine white linen of a stiff ruff framing her face, and adorned with the pearls and the jewels that were the proper ornament of a woman of her rank. It is the image of an Elizabethan lady at the summit of her realm, grave and stately and magnificent, dressed in the deliberate splendour by which the powerful of that age declared their place, and it is the very picture of what Bess had spent her existence becoming, the obscure gentry girl transformed into a grande dame of the realm, robed and jewelled and proud. But it is the face above the ruff that holds the eye, for in the portraits of Bess there looks out a countenance of remarkable strength and shrewdness, a face that tells, more plainly than any chronicle, of the character within. It is not a soft face, nor a gentle one. It is the face of a woman of power and will, watchful and intelligent and unyielding, the face of one who has fought hard for everything she holds and means to hold it still. There is shrewdness in it, the long calculating shrewdness of the woman of business. There is pride in it, the earned pride of the self-made magnate. There is strength in it, the iron strength of the will that carried her from the manor to the tower. One looks at that face and one believes at once in everything the story has told, in the 4 marriages and the imposing fortune and the towering houses, for here is plainly a woman who could do all of that and more, a person of formidable force, gazing steadily out across the centuries. The portraits of Bess are no flattering masks, but true likenesses of a powerful nature, and they bring us, perhaps, as close to the living woman as anything can, the proud, shrewd, strong old face of the girl from Hardwick, who made herself a lady, and around that central figure, the grand lady in her dark, rich gown, we may gather, in our last imagining, the entire bright world that she had built around her, the setting that matched the splendour of her person. Picture her moving through the vast chambers of Hardwick, the firelight and the candlelight catching the jewels at her throat and the rich dark stuff of her gown, the tall windows behind her holding the last light of the sky, the mighty tapestries glowing on the walls around her, the whole magnificent setting of her own creation, framing the magnificent figure she had made of herself. She had raised the dwelling and gathered the treasures and robed in splendour, all of it the work of her own will, all of it the expression of her own triumphant assent, and she moved through it as its sovereign, the grand lady in the grand hall, the perfect and the finished image of everything she had striven all her career to become. There she is then, the woman herself, robed and jewelled and proud, moving through the glittering rooms of her own fine mansion, the firelight on her strong old face, the very picture of a self-made greatness. Hold that image of her, the noble lady in her splendour, as we let the story come at last to its close. There is one more aspect of her existence that is worth our notice before we leave her, and it is one that the modern mind, used to staying settled in a single home, can easily overlook, for the magnates of Bess's age did not pass their lives fixed in one place, but moved, with the whole of their households, between the several houses that they held. A magnate of Bess's standing possessed not one seat, but a number of them, scattered across the country, and they would travel from one to another through the course of the year, taking up residence now here and now there as business and season and convenience required. The immense life was a wandering life, lived not in a single home, but across a constellation of houses. And when such a family moved, it did not move lightly, for it carried much of its establishment with it, the servants and the goods and the very furnishings of daily life, so that the removal of a large household from one house to another was a considerable undertaking, a small migration of people and possessions along the roads of the kingdom. There were good reasons for this restless moving, deeply rooted in the conditions of the age. A noble seat, lived in continuously, grew foul in time, and needed to be emptied and cleaned and aired, and so they would move on to another seat, and leave the first to be set in order against their return. The rhythm of moving was, in part, a rhythm of sweetening and refreshing the houses by turns. There were the seasons, too, and the sport for a magnate might remove to one house for the hunting, and to another for the better air at a different time of year, and there was always the call of business, that the need to be now in one part of one's estates and now in another, to oversee the lands and the building and the affairs that were spread across a wide countryside. And for the Countess in particular, in the long years of the captivity, there was the constant moving demanded by the keeping of the Queen of Scots, who was shifted from one of the Shrewsbury houses to another as security and circumstance required, so that the household must follow the royal prisoner in her enforced wanderings from Tutbury to Sheffield to Wingfield to Chatsworth and back again. The spectacle of a great household on the move was an impressive and a laborious thing, a train of carts and horses and people winding slowly along the rough roads of the land, bearing the family and its servants and a proud quantity of goods from one house to the next. For they carried much with them when they moved, not only their clothing and their personal effects, but a deal of the apparatus of a grand life, the hangings and the plate and the furnishings that turned a cold empty house into a fit residence for the great. The very tapestries might be taken down from the walls of one house and carried to clothe the walls of another. The carts were loaded high with the goods of the establishment. The servants travelled in their order and their numbers. The family rode at the head of the long procession, and so the whole train, scores of people and a mountain of possessions, made its slow way across the country from one seat to another. It was a kind of grand and a cumbersome ceremony, the removal of an imposing household, repeated again and again through the turning of the year, and the journeys themselves were slow, for the roads of that age were poor, and the pace of travel was nothing like the swiftness we now take for granted. A journey of a few score miles might be the labour of days, the train of the household crawling along the rutted tracks and the muddy ways, halting for the night at inns, or at the houses of friends along the route. To travel at all was an undertaking, and to travel with a domestic establishment was a slow and a wearisome business, dependent on the weather and the state of the roads, the carts lumbering through the mire in the wet seasons, the whole procession at the mercy of the rough conditions of the way. The region that a modern traveller might cross in an hour or two took the people of Bess's age the better part of a day or more to traverse, and the moving of a domestic establishment between distant houses was a journey to be planned and provisioned and endured. The slowness of it all gave a different shape to the year and to existence itself. The grand removals between the houses marking out the passage of the seasons, their place in the world measured by which of its several seats it happened, at any given time, to be occupying. Bess moved through this restless way of living, as the great always did, passing her years not in one fixed home, but across the several houses of her holding, now at Chatsworth in its valley, now at Hardwick on its hill, now, in the captive years, at one or another of the mighty Talbot seats where the Queen of Scots was kept. Her life was lived, for much of its course on the move, the formidable Countess and her people making their slow removals across the Derbyshire country and beyond, settling for a season in one stately dwelling, and then taking up again the train of carts and servants for the journey to the next. There is something to be felt in this, in the restlessness of the wandering existence, forever shifting from house to house across the rough roads of the age, never quite settled, always either arriving or departing, or preparing to depart. And there is something to be felt, too, in the contrast between this wandering existence and the noble fixed monument that she raised at the last, for in Hardwick Hall she made, perhaps, the residence that would hold her at the end of all her wanderings, the final seat where the moving years could come to their rest. That. For the arrival at a lordly hall, after the slow effort of the journey, had its own quiet satisfaction. The cold and empty rooms made warm and living again by the coming of the family, the fires lit in the hearths, the hangings rehung upon the walls, the establishment installed once more in its accustomed order. A house stood waiting dark and still, while the family was away at another of its seats. And then the long train came winding up the road, and the doors were opened, and the fires were kindled, and the dead house woke again to warmth and light and life. There was a homecoming in it, even to a seat one had not seen for months, the settling back into a familiar place, the resuming of the accustomed round, and the wandering existence had this much of comfort in it, that one moved always between houses that were one's own, from home to home across the wide countryside of one's holding. She knew that rhythm all her days, the long removals and the warm arrivals, the settling and the departing, the wandering existence of the great. And at the last she gathered it all toward the shining house upon the hill of her birth, the final home where the journey of her life would end. So we have seen her, now, in every aspect of her remarkable story, the wandering and the raising and the gathering, the marriages and the dynasty, the captive queen and the granddaughter of royal blood, the small girl and the great lady. We have walked with her the whole length of her years and looked at it from every side. There remains only to let her go and to bring our long evening together to its gentle close. Let the picture of her grow soft and dim, as a remembered face grows dim, and let the slow story settle and quiet itself, and let the night that has gathered while we talked draw fully down at last over the hill and the glass and the wind. For now the night has truly come, and our walk through the life of Bess of Hardwick draws to its end, and it is time to let her go, the old countess in her tower of glass, and to let the centuries close gently over her once again. We have followed her across the whole span of her story, from the small girl in the draughty manor to the great lady in the shining house, from the first contested jointure of a child widow to the founding of ducal dynasties, from obscurity to fame, from nothing to nearly everything. We have walked beside her up the whole height of her astonishing climb, And now we leave her where we found her in our imagining, at peace at the summit of her achievement, the house hushed, and the dark land spreading away beneath her windows, the fierce journey behind her at last. She lived and strove and built and triumphed and died 400 years ago and more, and her house still stands upon its hill, crowned with her initials against the sky, the lasting monument of a life that rose higher than almost any of its age. We may let her rest now, the child from Hardwick who made herself a lady. Her story is told, and the night has come. I am so glad to have spent these few hours in her company with you, walking the long road of her life together, while the dark gathered around us, and the quiet deepened. If these slow journeys through other lives and other ages are something you would like to find again, on the nights when sleep is slow in coming, then you would be most welcome to let them come and find you, with no hurry about it at all, and no pressure, simply by subscribing, so that another such evening will be waiting for you whenever you have need of it. There is no more to do tonight, and nothing more to think about, and nowhere at all that you need to be. The story is over, and the hall is dark, and the quiet of the night is yours to sink into now. Let the old countess rest in her tower of glass, and let the day's last thoughts go with her into the dark, and let yourself grow heavy and warm and still beneath the covers, here at the gentle end of our evening together. The fire has burned low, and the mansion is quiet, and it is time now to let go of the day and drift down softly into sleep. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.